I'm making this recording while driving, which is, I guess, not ideal because this is a rather delicate matter, but hopefully I'll do a good enough job. But let me think. I wanted to talk about karma, sort of on the heels of my last recording, because it's a weird noise. Probably because I'm thinking about it myself, although what I'm going to be exploring in this recording is much more simple, and I don't profess to be a genius in what I'm about to say, because what I'm about to say is just, let's say, regular morality, which is probably worth entrenching or worth sort of emphasizing. But around karma, I mean, the complicated matters that I'm dealing with is how to integrate an understanding of karma and what I generally regard as being related to the unconscious side of the mind with the other sides of the mind, after the other sides of the mind are in some kind of settled state that I'm still a bit experimenting with. And I have some very interesting notes that maybe I'm close to a synthesis, would be nice, but in some sense I'm trying to work out, because I do think that maybe there is a fundamental defect with the superego, and I do think that the ego is redeemable, but the superego is not redeemable. But if the superego is kind of held abated is properly cordoned off, then the subconscious essentially has to completely reorientate itself, because the subconscious existed ontologically only in the contractedness to the superego, and essentially that relatedness that it has is fundamentally poisonous. It's as poisonous as the original toxin that the superego represents. But although the superego can, let's say, be healed through the ego, through the technology of the crucifixion, basically, that then I'm still trying to work out, because I still think that the superego is somewhat problematic, that you can, let's say, indirectly deal in the superego via the unconscious side of the mind if you can still continue to operate some semblance of the karmic circuits, as it were, but then you are trying to do so in a transcendental way. So you've kind of got a balance between your subconscious, which will have to be completely renewed in some sense, built in the image of the ego, which is built towards transcending the karmic field circuits and stuff like that. Anyway, so I've got kind of that up in the air, which is why I just wanted to make like a moral primer on karma. So it's also because it's very politically relevant at the moment, because essentially identity politics is very toxic, is very, let's say, Keegan stage 2.5 or something like that, or it's a weird juxtaposition, because in some sense it's a bit of borderline personality disorder, which is almost like Keegan stage 4.5, and it's a bit of narcissistic disorder, which is what I would roughly maybe vaguely term Keegan stage 2.5, and there's a weird kind of alliance between those two in an ideological confection in which they both collaterally, codependently sort of support each other, and it's a very toxic mix of a weird kind of plutocracy with an inner esoteric circle and a kind of occult sort of, kleptocracy and plutocracy, and then you have this kind of pleb class with this kind of false consciousness propaganda narrative around how good the identity is, and the pride of the identity is exalted by the glorious leadership or whatever. And so you get this disgusting form of vanguardism, or this kind of revolutionary aristocracy, these armchair people that elevate themselves by being leaders and mascots of the identitarian downtrodden or something like that. But which is generally, I think, what is also baked into a lot of cultural toxicity, which I would generally regard that as being the fascist mentality of justice in some sense. Like, you can be a fascist in some spheres of operation, and so, in taste, in humor, maybe you want to be as sensitive to the general mood or whatever, or you want to say, well, no, my humor has a genre, it has an audience. I'm not trying to be a broad populist in my humor, in my comedy. But then there are also very toxic ideological forms of comedy, I would say, that have this kind of Anyway, let me get into that, talking from just talking about karma. So this is the problem with karma. Let me just give you a little narrative about karma, because then you'll kind of see where I'm going with everything that I just said, which is almost like a sociological generalization. But let me just talk about it from the ground up, from the individual scale, and also talk about how justice would actually deal with this. So the problem with karma, right, is that it doesn't work. It's not karma is not a mirror, because other people are not mirrors to your karmic false ego complex. Everyone has a different style of false ego complex, to begin with at least. I mean, I'm not saying that people can't become enlightened and they can't transcend their own false ego. I'm not saying that. But in some sense, you also need to understand that other people have false egos, which are distinct to your false ego. So even if you can transcend your own, you don't really transcend it unless you also have a certain sensitivity to others. Now, that's a general sort of claim to make. Let me qualify that. So in some sense, the problem with karma is that some people are masochists and some people are sadists. Now that's a dualism, that's also a false dichotomy, but like, generally speaking, you can dynamically interpret that to not be a false dichotomy, because it exists. Let me just say that exists on many different metrics. So let me just expound this in a technical way. So in some sense, just because I have a certain karmic causative content in my false ego context, I have been discomforted by my own belief structure, which weighs heavily on me. It burdens me. It makes me uncomfortable. But that doesn't mean that I want you to be uncomfortable to make me comfortable. Like it's not this perfect projection that I project my discomfort onto others, and then I gain comfort by projecting my discomfort onto others. It's not that kind of equivalent exchange. It doesn't function that way. It's more like how I am uncomfortable is how I feel, and I believe that I am uncomfortable. I want you karmically to correspond with how I feel about my own discomfort. So it's a collateral propensity. It's a correspondence. It's not an equivalence. It's a correspondence. So it's a relatability in some sense. And because everyone has their own unique metric of relatability, because everyone doesn't have the same set of beliefs, they have different kinds of belief in some sense, you can actually get people that are karmically capable of supporting one another very stably, because the one is a masochist on that metric and the other one is a sadist on that metric. And are they abusing each other? Are they abusing each other? That's the problem of karma, is when a masochist and a sadist find peace with each other, are they abusing each other? Now, I would say yes, they are abusing each other. That's the problem with karma, is that, okay, and let me just put this in the legal context. Is it illegal for people to abuse each other in this way? It can't be. It can't be illegal. Because if it is illegal, then you're basically piercing the individual realm. You're piercing self-ownership, self-accountability, responsibility. So the idea is that, oh, well, karma is evil and let's clean up all the karma or something like that. But you've got these two people that are feeding each other parasitically in some sense, or stabilizing each other. The one is a masochist, the other one is a sadist. And it can't be illegal, but it's still wrong. So this is essentially the problem of karma and morality in a nutshell. Which is a little bit hidden in the scriptural reference, give and it will be given. And Carl Jung, I think, basically transcribed give and it will be given, but he put it in a kind of psychodynamic sort of way to some degree, and it's not exactly as precise as give and it will be given. It does actually, but it does give you a question as to the knowledge that is needed in the system, which is, what did Carl Jung say famously? What you resist persists. Whatsoever you shall resist shall persist. So in some sense you have to understand that resistance is futile, but there's also the problem of how do you know if you're resisting or not, because you need a level of self-knowledge perhaps, of an accurate and direct and truthful self-knowledge to even see your own resistances and things like that. You have to kind of know more broadly. Anyway, so in some sense the problem of knowledge, or the problem of spiritual knowledge perhaps. So this is why it's people have known about, let's say, the crux or the conundrum or the let's say the problem of dichotomies and false dichotomies and karma. People can know that. The problem is, how does it relate to everything else that's going on? Because in some sense the problem is not just karma, because you're not just an unconscious side of the mind. That might be where all the illusion is and self-delusion is coming into the picture, but there are also other substrate sort of things to be cleared up, and things that are above the substrate as well, which, let's say, are emergent role actualization sort of issues or whatever. So you've got an ontological problem, which is the ontological development of the false ego complex, but then you've also got an epistemological problem, which is like, well, what are you going to do about it after the fact? Yeah, we live in a fallen world and you have a false ego complex, so how are you going to fix it? How are you going to clear it up? And then you have all the different schools of different enlightenments, and a lot of enlightenments are false essentially because they're not justified. And in some sense, when you try to get yourself out of karma, people are out of karma. There are a lot of people in the East, in India, that are gurus, and they have escaped karma, but they have not escaped it properly because they cannot justify it to other people. They cannot join other people in their enlightenment. They can maybe say, yes, I see that you are as enlightened as me. We have the same quality of enlightenment. Maybe they can do that. But who knows which one has got a better one? Or they'll say, well, we can't know which one has got a better one. Well, I think I can tell who's got a better one and who's got a worse one, because I think that my self-actualization is justified and I can understand it and I can share it therefore as a cultural edifice. So in some sense, I think that the truth is that you have to have a culture of enlightenment, not an individual that's enlightened. And when you have a culture of enlightenment, then in some sense you can't say that you are enlightened, but you can say that I have the capacity to be enlightened when I am around other people who are thus inclined to engage in that cultural brotherhood is actually the word that is used in the scriptures. The brethren, the spiritual brotherhood, because the spirit is a masculine. There's a kind of hermetic alchemy in the scriptures, I think, quite clearly. But anyway. Which is very, very clear when you read Genesis, and everything is said after his kind. The creeping things that creepeth, the trees with the fruits that as the seed of the fruit-bearing tree in itself, is all after his kind. So even plants, it says, is his kind. That there's this idea that there's a masculine force in the mind that is in the Hebrew it might be connected to chokmah or whatever. The spark of sort of creative instinct or whatever, and then the soul, which contains all of this. Let's say the boundary of the responsibility and the spiritual accountability in all of its spheres of operation as a distinct individual within the context of a culture, because in some sense the soul doesn't even make sense without the potential communion between souls. The soul is feminine, so male and female made he them. But the prepositional he, the thinking, the thought form, the word in the mind, that is in some sense in the spiritual metaphor that's masculine, or it's male. And this came through in the early English. It was much more obvious because there was no such thing as man. There was woman and wereman. Both sexes had a prefix to them. We didn't just say man and woman. We said wereman and woman. So they both had prefixes. Anyway, and I think that's perhaps allowed for a kind of cultural breathing room in which there was an understanding that gender was, in the connotative sense, that, you know, that at least there was room for a kind of hermetic alchemy or something like that. But anyway, I'm really dabbling all over the place here. But so, and I think that what I say about karma is exactly the short narrative that needs to be said, is that masochists and sadists are abusing each other, but it can't be illegal, but it's still morally wrong. And that is essentially the problem of history in a nutshell, the problem of the state, the problem of justification in some sense. That you need to be sophisticated enough that you can kind of square all those circles in that complicated set of events, of implications and insinuations, that we can't have a state that makes it illegal, but we do have to have, let's say, a knowledge of psychology that tells people when they ask that it is actually not justified. So, you know, this is the difference between, I do think that the two authorities that need to be cleaned up in our society and in our civilization for us to become an evolved species, evolved in the sense of Star Trek, is we need a refined judicial system and we need a refined psychology. And with those two hard structures in place, and they, in some sense you could say, the one keeps track of the soft power in a society, it keeps the culture safe, the knowledge of psychology in some sense, or a refined knowledge of a psychology that doesn't have false authority in it, will keep us safe in the soft side of things, that the culture won't become toxic and polluted by fascistic overreaches and political demagoguery and toxic ideologies and such and such. And if you have also a refined judicial system that won't respect false authority as well, that won't just, you know, fall for anyone that uses fancy words and then they come with excuses after their title because, well, this is the best knowledge that we have. It doesn't matter that we don't really know what the hell that we're doing, but, you know, we can manage symptoms. So listen to me, Mr. Judge, when I want to put someone under electroshock therapy, or I want to lobotomize them, or I want to cut them up, or something like that. We don't know what the hell we're doing, but somehow I'm the most efficacious thing that our civilization does, and it doesn't matter if it's barbarism. It doesn't matter if it's I think that is actually exactly the definition of barbarism. But anyway. Anyway, let me stop this recording. I should say, I'm kind of being a bit explicit and metaphorical, but in some sense I think that chemical intervention into someone's psychology is perhaps much worse than physical surgery, perhaps even. In some sense, the physical surgery thing, at least, you know that you're doing some kind of triage because you know that you're dealing with something that you don't know how to do. But when you're dealing with psychiatric intervention, in some sense, that's a line of human experimentation to some degree. If you don't know what you're doing, but you're giving someone a slow poison, in some sense, that you're trying to ameliorate something. As a I always say this phrase wrong. As a stopgap measure, maybe you can say, well, we don't know what we're doing, and we think that this is the best, least invasive way of doing it. But you really have to do it with some kind of humility, and you also have to maybe respect when people are legally competent to, let's say, or have the legal capacity to deny treatment and such. Because, you know, being, let's say, psychologically insane and being legally insane are not the same thing. At least in the current framing. And there isn't enough legal sensitivity to this in many jurisdictions, but that's because the legal tradition in many countries is quite barbaric. I'll put it like that, rather. Anyway, I just want to recollect my thoughts now. I think I messed up that talking about karma in some sense. I can't even remember sort of how I left it off. but it certainly needs to be gone over again and refined to some degree. And it's a bit of a strange analogy, but I do think that's so I'm kind of embarrassed that I kind of put it through in such a kind of blunt way and using the analogy of sociology and law or something like that. But I'd have to sort of tease that out a bit more. But anyway, I'll talk about it in the direct psychological, not in the metaphor of these things, but in the direct psychological thing to kind of show at least my workings out in the direct field that it's meant to apply to in some sense. So I've been fighting with the idea of how if the superego is redeemed, or at least comes full circle with the ego, sort of augmenting into it and therefore filling in the nebulous backstory of the false prophet and therefore somewhat perhaps bringing it into the fold in a sense, creating this back channel that fills in the gap in the false ego complex so that it can have the potential to no longer be false, then I've been sitting with the problem of, well, can you think through things with the superego? Can you think through things with the subconscious? Because the subconscious is this kind of aftermath of the traumatized childhood, which in some sense everyone is going to be traumatized. I don't think there's a way to not be traumatized, because at some point you have to leave the subconscious behind in order to develop the ego and the unconscious as a kind of independent dual function, and then the subconscious gets left behind in the dust, as it were, because it was always problematic. In some sense, it was always, let's say, poisoned by this naive narcissism. In some sense, it has no hope of ever kind of fixing that naive narcissism, because the whole thing is premised on, let's say, contractedness to the false prophet, and essentially that prime death that is the trial of the false prophet that was repurposed as the subconscious's prime death is something like that contract, and that contract is kind of like the constitution of the subconscious, and it can't get away from that. And that's a deep sort of poison pill in some sense. And so I'm still trying to work out if the subconscious can be anything other than discharge, that somehow it has pent up energy. It's wound up, and it's structured in the nature of that contractedness and the nature of that prime death. And that obviously primes the unconscious side of the mind, which inherits that ghost, that inherits that closet full of skeletons in some sense. And that also, let's say, in the analogy of the unconscious side of the mind, that's like, you've got your files in the filing cabinet, and then there's everybody else's files in the filing cabinet when you're in the unconscious side of the mind, because then you are assimilating other people's false ego complexes. And so you can kind of augment your files with everybody else's files, and then you can maybe find a way to go along and get along in the field circuits of everybody else's false ego complex, and there you might be able to find some kind of collateral support. And then, the problem with karma, the problems with the fields of karma, is that essentially you can't tell if you're actually transcending karma or if you've just found a niche, because you've kind of kicked away your own ladder to know what you're bringing to the party in order to orientate yourself towards the role that you're going to be playing in terms of the actualization of the ego. So the ego is in the present frame. The ego is in the present time. The subconscious is something like your memory and your history of your actual ontological lead into this collective delusion, because in some sense the unconscious side of the mind is not just your personal delusion, but it's primarily that, but it's also plugged into the collective delusion of other people's false ego complexes. Because essentially, as you exhibit your emotional tone in the circuitry of your false ego complex, that those emotional tones are also connected in field circuits to other people's false ego complexes. So in some sense, other people are vicarious organs of your false ego complex, potentially. And this is problematic, because this means that essentially you can create waves in other anatomies that you don't even fully understand, because you would have to understand field circuits to understand that. And even if you do understand the principles of field circuits, you would need to know the field circuit in the particular, which has a history that's longer than yours, because you're born into it and it's already pre-existing. And it's been pre-existing since the beginning of the fall. Let me just put it like that. But if, in any case, it's older than you are. And there are themes and there are processes that are older than you are in it. So that's a lot of weight to bear in the ego when you are crucifying the sin of the world, because in some sense then the only way to extricate yourself is to carry the sin of the world in your body, at least the sin that your false ego complex conceives of, the sin that your false ego complex so the sin of the world is not anything and everything. It's when you are crucifying yourself for the sins of the world, in some sense, it is a sin of the world, but it's not all the sin of everybody else's false ego complex. So that's an interesting distinction to make as well, and in some sense it only goes as far as your eyes do see. So you're crucifying yourself for the emergent sin that your false ego complex has at hand. Now, okay, I don't want to dwell too much on this, but it is closely related to what I'm about to say. Is that then I was thinking, okay, well then, what does the technology of the crucifixion actually get you, and where is the New Jerusalem? Because I've kind of theoretically experimented with saying, well, is it in the superego? Is it in the subconscious? And now I think I'm of the mind that it's in neither. I don't think that, going back to my Platonic metaphysic, I don't think you can see the sudden from the left-hand side of the divided line. I think you can only see the sudden from the right-hand side of the divided line, which then will have a resonance in the unconscious and it'll have a resonance in the ego. If I'm roughly superimposing, the lesser of the lesser segment of the divided line is like the superego, and the greater of the lesser is the subconscious, and the lesser of the greater is the unconscious, and the greater of the greater is like the ego. Anyway, making those correspondences. So in that, I think then what the technology of the crucifixion gets you is that you end up up in the clouds. You end up based out in your ego, not based out of anything else. So you're based out in the ego, the static, the one, the good, the greater of the greater. And you are, let's say, in frequency of that, your unconscious side of the mind, your navigation of your particular unconscious for your false ego complex, then becomes transcendental in its karmic interluding, its karmic interluding. And I think that you let sleeping dogs lie in terms of the superego and the subconscious, because as long as the ego is crucifying itself, then essentially the subconscious will naturally discharge any pent-up contractedness that is still lingering. And in some sense, those things exist more in the field circuit at that point. They no longer exist in the subconscious, but they exist as aberrances and misalignments and, to use a term from Scientology, N theta or N mest. Because I mean, you could describe field circuits as either being comprised of theta, mest, and N theta and N mest, perhaps, and perhaps in some sense there's only theta and mest. Those are not hard distinctions, because some of those distinctions are quite soft. Because in some sense, if you're not in the right cultural setting, in some sense it's not a question of what you're doing; it's a question of how you're doing it and when you're doing it. It's almost a question of timing. in some sense, although that's a very problematic way of putting it, but in some sense, and timing in some sense, what makes something the wrong timing is not up to you, it's also up to other people, because other people also have free will in some sense. So the only time that timing ever becomes appropriate is within the context of a shared faith or something like that. So in some sense, if I'm correct, then the New Jerusalem, therefore, is something like the dominant function in the ego, and therefore it's always spiritual. It's always in the eye of the beholder in some sense. It's not in the world. And therefore, you only ever get, let's say, a corresponding kingdom in the unconscious side of the mind, which is something like a demarcated space, which only those with the spiritual eyes will see it. So, yeah, you don't actually get any kind of real transformation in some sense, but it's in the twinkling of an eye. It's not in a it's not going to be labeled, because flesh and blood will not inherit the kingdom, because the kingdom is made up out of flesh and blood. Anyway, so, and in some sense, the reason why you cannot approach the sudden, or you cannot see the sudden or experience the sudden from the left hand side of the divided line, the dividing line between the lesser of the lesser and the greater of the lesser, you cannot see the sudden from the left hand side, you can only see it from the right hand side, is because in some sense, on the left hand side is in some sense archetypally very much in line with the flesh and the blood. And so the flesh and the blood cannot observe the kingdom. Or certainly the flesh can't. I think the blood can bear witness to the spirit. But the blood itself, I don't think, has discerning. I guess that's an important philosophical distinction that I'll have to try to meditate on how to language it. I don't even know how. That's the kind of channel of manifestation that the blood is finally reduced into being, the bandwidth of potentiality that is created by the witnessing in the blood. In some sense, the kingdom will not be in some kind of formulaic reduction in the blood, I think. You wouldn't be able to sort of style guide it. But there would be something like a special admixture, a special set of ingredients with the right understanding on the right side of the divided line, with the spirit witnessing that style guided blood. Then you have, let's say, the twinkling of the eye, then you have the something magical. But without the spiritual understanding, the blood is just, it might as well be the blood of I mean, in some sense, I think there is something more special about the blood of a being that is sentient, that is capable of having free will. But that is not the same thing as the blood of something that it doesn't have sentience. So I mean, but in some sense, that's something that's capable of having conceptual understanding and something that's not capable of having conceptual understanding. Anyway, I've babbled on enough about this. So it still ends up being quite ephemeral, sadly. There's no real... Still ends up being ephemeral. But anyway, was there anything else I had to say about the subconscious? So, and in some sense, then the subconscious becomes a slave, I believe. It becomes like a... but that kind of enslavement is a very useful catharsis of the contractedness that it had before. The contractedness that it had to the false prophet. And in some sense, if there is... it shouldn't even be called enslavement. In some sense, it's like a sort of... it's quiet. It's like a stilled sea. It's like... and so in that quietness, in some sense, it just means that the subconscious... the superego is not going to have to promulgate a kind of rectification from an internally sourced in some sense, I think that the 3 days before the resurrection of the crucifixion, because you are crucifying yourself daily, so there's always this 3-day lag, which is a metaphor of saying that essentially between the sin of the ego and which is the death of the superego, each sin that you contain within your body of the ego becomes essentially an awareness of the superego and the unconscious puppet string within the unconscious side of the mind, and that eventually kind of leads on to having to have the ego actualize a role that is covering for the unconscious side of the mind's sort of intracted plugged inness and mess or whatever. But so this is a bit messy to even talk about. But essentially, what I'm just trying to say is that because you end up becoming full circle in this way, you don't have to worry so much about messing up because you feel it. You have to be accountable to it at the end of the day. So it kind of, you self-rectify it to some degree through the self-crucifixion, essentially. So that has, let's say, an internal procedure where everything is fine then. But the point, though, that I'm trying to make, though, is the lingering charge and the lingering problem, in some sense, is the uncleanness of the subconscious, which won't necessarily automatically get cleaned up. It's interesting because, I mean, I've been meditating on this problem and I have started uncovering more thematic elements to, let's say, my prime death in my subconscious. And that is quite cathartic as well, to uncover that. And to, in some sense, I don't feel completely unburdened by my prime death yet, by the contract, which in some sense gets revived by the parent function in the subconscious, as the parent function eventually plugs your inferior function and the sin of the subconscious into a distinct side of the mind, which becomes the unconscious side of the mind. In some sense, the unconscious side of the mind is the creation of the parent function in the subconscious, because it just wants to get away from its own sin, or from the sin of the subconscious, because it becomes unbearable, and essentially it also wants to get rid of the toxic element of the inferior function so that the subconscious can sort of have an internal circuit. Now, that kind of internal circuitry, to some degree, is going to have a real strong magnetic resonance with dysfunction that is played out in the unconscious side of the mind. So there's going to, let's say, there's going to be a mirror image between the tacit. When I say mirror, because it's not going to be a perfect one for one image, because there are going to be slight inversions in it. Give and it will be given. What is it? I just gave. I was just giving. What do you mean it will be given? What is it? Give and. It's not give and what you give, it will be given. It says give and it will be given. So what was it? You don't know what it is until you know what everything else is happening in the field circuits. So it, in some sense, requires a big question mark. What is it? Do we know what it is? And in some sense, that is only fully answered when we have a spiritual eye to know what the kingdom is. Because without the kingdom grounding what things are, what is it? What is it? What is anything? Who knows what anything actually is? The only thing that we would have to put it in a context and a reference. And what context and reference is eternal? And in some sense, that's problematic as well, because this is held within hope and it's held within faith. Without a faith, you don't have a vision of what anything is. There is no way to ground. The only way to ground anything is in the intuition. You can't ground it in rationality. Rationality only tells you what's self-consistent. It doesn't tell you what it is. Self-consistency can't tell you what something actually is, because that requires, well, I mean, you're in some sense presuming some capability of objective perspective, or at least contextualized perspective, or broad acceptable expected. I mean, like, how are you going to define I mean, the problem. So you want to define what it is. Now you have to really define, well, objective. How can you prove that it is objective rather than subjective when everyone is just a subjective entity? The idea that you're going to have a cult of rationality that then says, well, we all claim to be rational, and when we all claim to be rational, then we call that objective. Well, there are other rationalities. There are rationalities which you can't, this is the problem of set theory. There is no set theory that explains the set of all sets or whatever. So it's like, you're really barking up the wrong Tower of Babel. Already, so already you're being quite irrational in some sense to create a rationality cult. Mr. Supposed self-consistency can't even keep himself anchored in his own stupid schema in some sense. And then you just say, well, we have the power in the world, so we make a dominion, and we are legion, and so don't question our authority, because we know that we're a false authority, so shut the fuck up and let us get on with it, and then you have that kind of fascist mentality, which is the corruption and the wickedness of all the hard structures of power, because they're not willing to, let's say, get into the ephemeral thing. Well, okay, well, how about, let's say, let's be joined in a hope, and then let's say, is this the best hope that we could be having? Is this a good hope? Is it at least good enough for this context? And then let's be bound in a faith that is somewhat within and above that hope, or let's say is that puts a boundedness on the hope that gives you an intuiting ability, because I guess this is the difference between faith and intuition, is that you don't say that you're faithing something, you say that you're intuiting something. Because if you have a hope for something, then there's perhaps something that can be invented, there's something that can be created, or that there's a context that can be repurposed. And, although in some strange a priori sense you can say there's nothing new under the sun, well, I guess that depends on your notion of time and how special you think the present is. But the point about time is that the subjective experience of time, the immediate conscious presence of placing attention in the present time and being responsible for what's going on in the present time, and therefore having a reality that is under the control of direct subjective input. So then we can have a shared reality, we can have a shared communication, we can have an open communication, where we establish and maintain and negotiate our lines of communication. And in the sense that we are intuiting towards the same answer that's going to answer the same question. Because it's one thing to have a shared good hope, it's another thing to be capable of agreeing on delivering on that hope. And so somewhat the cultural bounds, and when I say culture, I mean that in the ephemeral sense of, well, you can say that you live in a culture, but the only culture that you actually really inhabit is the culture that your faith corresponds to, and that is you're capable of sharing that faith with somebody else. Because if you don't have a shared faith, you don't have a single faith, then you really just have a schism waiting to happen that maybe hasn't fully ripened and manifested yet. And so within those bounds, that's almost created de facto by the, let's say, the discovery and the recovery and the exploration of the common law in the form in which the common law is explored, at least in the South African legal tradition, which has, let's say, a fixed mark of the principled substantive law. So in some sense, the fixed mark of the substantive law, which in principle already is complete and fixed, then allows that then the common law exploration of it is a shared meditation in some way as well. But it also, let's say, is troubled by other issues of, let's say, which in some sense would be the same type of mixed affair that you would have to orchestrate if you were trying to discover things about how things work in nature, and how the calculus of many different physical, mechanical phenomena and such, and how to articulate them into, new forms of utility or whatever. And so essentially everything becomes very much like the analogy of cooking in a kitchen. That all the ingredients there's nothing new under the sun in terms of the ingredients, but there are in a sense rediscoveries and recreations of, let's say, an almost static, the good, the one, recollection of how magic is made, in the kitchen, as it were. I mean, to use this metaphor, perhaps overly so, but essentially everything becomes like the art of the culinary science. And it's very interesting to think that essentially the proto scientist, in some sense, looked a lot like a chef. White get up, white garb. But let me just also say that I mean, a big problem that we've generally had is that science itself is very much like um, people that are dealing with uh, the shadow intellectualism of people that came before them that actually had real understandings about grammar and about tracking what was actually fully understood. Newton really did break science in an intellectual way when he kind of uh, knew that he was creating mathematical models of things that were not they were not explanatory, they were just descriptive. Noam Chomsky has an excellent lecture on this. I think it's called, man, I'm having trouble remembering the name of the lecture. I think it was called The Limits of Understanding the Ghost in the Machine, The Nature of Science, something like that. Something like the Limits of Human Understanding and the Ghost in the Machine, I think is the name of the lecture. I should say this before anything bad happens to Noam Chomsky, so if this gets to him, then maybe he can think about confirming it. But I actually helped Noam Chomsky design that lecture, as I also uh, gave a preliminary talk to that auditorium in that university, because I told them, I said, look, I know Noam Chomsky, but I just want to, I can't remember, I was listening, I think, to somebody else's lecture, which I interrupted because I was attending this university. Just shows how shitty my memory is, because I can't even remember the name of the university, but it was fairly high up there university. So I interrupted this whole lecture and I said, look, I'm actually friends with Noam Chomsky, and what you're talking about here is complete shit, or something like that. Or I actually gave a preliminary talk after listening to a lecture that I completely hated, and I sat through it, or something like that. But I just remember I was insulting a lot of people when I was speaking, and I said, look, you've got it so backwards, it's disgusting. And I really, but I understand that I'm not going to have the words to be able to rectify this, and you certainly are going to shout at me. And I was even taking a lot of flack when I was making this preliminary talk. But I was, and then so I just said, so help me help you to perhaps help me. So I said, okay, I just want to brainstorm here out in the open. Let's talk about these questions, because I have serious reservations and serious problems with these conjecturous things that you seem to be flying about here, and you all think that you're Superman, but to me, you are so corrupted in your pseudo-intellectualism. And I know that this sounds very, very insulting, so let's just start fielding some of these questions. And the context was already bounded in the talk that I had to sit through, that I thought was just so completely poisonous and vile. And so I teased out all of the big questions from this kind of brainstorming session, which was almost, in a sense, it was vectored in on hate towards me, because I was almost being this conductor of hate in this auditorium in this preliminary talk. And the whole premise of my talk was essentially, I know Noam Chomsky, and I dislike your intellectualism, which that I'm calling pseudo-intellectualism. So let's tease out let's say, the steel man of your position. And already in that auditorium and going through that process and being this conductor of the hate, uh, um, I was able to at least synthesize to some people in the hall the great terror and the great terrific nature of their hubristic conceit and impudence. Because even in steel manning them, a lot of people could almost, as a premonition, they could see the end of their own disgusting pseudo-intellectualism, because they could see the limits, how they crowd, how they essentially converge towards the end of their own extreme, disgusting. Anyway, and then I can't remember how long in the future it was. I think it was sort of 3 months later or something like that. So I mean, because Noam Chomsky is far more learned than I am, but so I brainstormed it with him, and because I mean, Noam Chomsky understands how to lay out an argument QED. I don't know how to lay out an argument QED, and he also knows how to source other people's thinking in it. But I mean, so I already gave him the framework. Newton was a fuck up. He fucked up science. Psychology is completely misunderstood because everyone's looking at it from a kind of Newtonian perspective, and it's so fucking intellectually corrupt. It's insane. And Noam Chomsky ended up writing. I mean, I can't claim that I wrote the lecture. I mean, because he does have a way with words, and but I would like to say that I co-authored that, and this is my story behind it in some sense. But I might be a crackpot. I mean, I really might know not. I mean, this might all be a transpersonal projection. I mean, I don't even know the date that this happened. I mean, I'm certainly a very deranged person. So I have memories that I can't make full accounting of. But I have these particular memories. I have these very particular. I mean, it's such a strange storyline for me to have in my head. I mean, it could be that I watched the Noam Chomsky lecture on YouTube, and then I invented all these memories. Maybe that's what happened. Anyway, it's. I do feel awkward always because when I say things like this, I'm revealing secrets that don't just belong to me. Um, anyway, but I'm just going to put that out there. That I mean, so either I'm really an atypical crackpot that invents memories and convolutes things, or there's something to this. But I mean, I also remember being in the audience of when Noam Chomsky almost didn't talk because he was so late, because the airport made him late, and people weren't sure if he was going to make the lecture, and that's when I met Janis. This is so embarrassing. I always forget how to say his name, and I haven't read his name in such a long time that I have actually forgotten how to pronounce it. But the Greek finance minister during the this is so embarrassing. He would be livid that I have forgotten him. You see, I can say what a lot of the sounds in his surname sound like, but it's so embarrassing to get such a. I guess I haven't spoken to him in so long that it's problematic. I really used to like my left wing friends to some degree, but I feel like they have somewhat grown a bit stale. There's been a lot of hypocrisy that has grown in the shadow of Noam Chomsky, and it used to be that people in the Noam Chomsky camp would be eager to say, look at all the manufacturing consent that happened from big tech around getting Trump out, but somehow we'll just close a blind eye to that because we like the narrative of him getting removed. So we'll just ignore the big tech censorship and the manufacturing consent around that. Um, this is probably the greatest defect that I see in Noam Chomsky's, and in some sense, it crops up. I mean, I really do think that Slavoj Žižek stands out as a star because he has walked the line, the line of complexity, the line of sophistication, like a star. He really has. He has, to a large extent, he has endured as one of the he kept his powder dry, he kept his nuance, even when it cost him, even as it still costs him, in the American scene, as it were, in the corrupted American scene, which I do just think that it needs more harsh critique, the American culture, especially the so-called left American culture, um, this revolutionary, uh, uh, anyway, I've got all these recordings that I think go into these issues of, the perennial trade-off between sympathy and sustainability. And I do think that we do all suffer from being ungrateful for capitalism and not rallying to its defense. And we do so at our own peril. I think that we should try to save capitalism. And then in that context, then we try to do something different from capitalism within a healthy capitalism, within a stabilized, defaulted system of capitalism that we must preserve as a default, because we don't want to create authoritarian, tyrannical, one-size-fits-all, lowest common denominator uh, uh, boot camp societies. Anyway, that's my particular, that's only my particular opinion, as they say. Um, some people bother about, they don't bother about opinions. They only care about generic sociological reductions and generalizations thrown about, because supposedly that's somehow more exacting, when in fact it's the opposite. Because unless you can share in a good faith, and in some sense that's how you discuss, let's say, the possible permutation and manifestation of high level thinking, is that you create suggestions, you create prompts, you create, let's say, um, an exploration of the salient ingredients that seem like they are necessary for the next step. In some sense, it's a bit difficult to understand how to cook with somebody else that you're unfamiliar with, but in some sense, I mean, and this is where, let's say, psychological knowledge to some degree, the knowledge of how people functionally function and how they functionally dysfunction, is a very interesting kind of via negativa to bound the, let's say, in some sense, I do think that is, in some sense, the only knowledge that ends up growing, in some sense, that the knowledge of understanding and wisdom uh, is something like what's spoken about in Proverbs, the dark sayings of the Lord, is in a via negativa. That in some sense the door's not, but in some sense it's not that you know the hall's not to venture down, the door's not to try to open, but in some sense that metaphor is not about what you're doing, it's about how you're doing it. It's about stylism, because you can almost you can make special dispensation for anything. This is why, for example, the high courts in my country can condone any procedural irregularity. They can conduct their own unique procedure. They have that power. Obviously, the more irregular your procedure, the further problematic it becomes, because then on appeal, if you look like you're in completely uncharted territory and you have no theoretical basis that you're outlining for how you're conducting the procedure, then in some sense you've thrown the proceedings up in the air, and then you've also made it in some sense you've spoiled the record. The court of record now can't really be read in review, so you've kind of you have to make sure that you stay justified in the record. This is why the legal system has been such a brilliant undergirding of, let's say, the potential of having a morally enlightened culture, at least in my legal tradition, which is, again, I say, is the best legal tradition in the world. And I'll say as well that I've always really enjoyed the fact that I've been able to get all the intellectuals that I have rubbed shoulders with to to say some of these things. Roger Scruton, I got him to say some brilliant things about the. I think he even explicitly said brilliant things about the Roman Dutch system. But anyway, I believe he did. Now I'm actually failing to remember the exact thing. But anyway, this is problematic now that I'm talking about things that, you know. I mean, I really have known such wonderful people that have enriched my life, knowing them and intellectualizing with them and sharing an exploration of faith and of weighty matters. David Belinsky, the Hitchens brothers. This is a bit touchy, I guess, because I'm always going to forget people. I mean, now people that are sadly deceased. And it's also annoying that when I can't even pronounce their names very well anymore. So far in my history it was. And my speech patterns have obviously, I mean, I had to sort of relearn my whole vocabulary almost twice, having 3 major manic episodes. But you know, I remember when I met Piaget, when he was being taught by when Jordan Peterson was a student of his. Some of this, anyway, all these sort of strange memories. I mean, when you're a child, you don't even know, perhaps, maybe I'm concocting this from dreams or something like that. Maybe I was just being looked after by people, and then I had dreams about their own historical context or something like that. But I mean, I also remember being a child in France and having very, very strange conversations with Pere Girard about the different intellectual moods of the different nationalities within continental Europe. And I really liked Pere Girard because, in some sense, you know, I really like the malcontents in each country. Like, you know, you find a real classical liberal German lawyer complain about German society, and I'm enraptured. You know, when you find the right malcontent in a society that is so vividly critical of their own culture, there's something about the sweet music of wisdom and piercing truth that calls you towards the crucifixion somewhat. Anyway, let me stop babbling. But and I must say, I mean, when I have been involved with these people, it has always been. Sometimes it's been very problematic because Piaget was very problematic for me because I knew him when I was too young. I could not even engage with Piaget's thinking because I would always have to invent a common vocabulary, and Piaget's thinking was too complicated for me. But I had much easier time with philosophers. It was much easier for me to even, I mean, I had even a small friendship with Foucault, which is a bit strange because Foucault didn't actually die when he supposedly died. I think he did have AIDS, but he wanted to exit public life, and that was a bit annoying, and so he faked his death, and anyway, but and he continued to live, I think, for about 8 years, but it was incredibly problematic for him. The blow that he had from Noam Chomsky, he kind of carried that as a wound. But I mean, I must say, I mean, it was problematic because I mean, I always had these interesting arguments with Foucault, and then in some sense, some of those arguments he even developed into more of his thinking. But when I eventually, um, I think quite convincingly debunked his whole philosophy and his whole framework, uh, it really poisoned things between us. I think I was only 9 years old or something. Um, but I actually convincingly, even as a premonition, predicted essentially that the people who followed his way of thinking would would become what has become. I mean, so in some sense, I mean, I've seen the future from an intellectual perspective. Um, so I mean, I've had a bit of I've had a bit of a heads up, but in some sense, I've always tried to make my insight public knowledge. I mean, this is the premise of the Lex, which was a sci-fi series, which is meant to be a social commentary on the cultural degeneration that was inevitable, to some degree. But I mean, I don't look. In some sense, I don't. This existed before I was born. This bullshit started in the '60s. This had nothing to do with me. I'll say that. I so I mean, I've sort of bumbled into these things to some degree, but I also think that I can cut through them like a knife. But then I've had my forays with religion as well. Then I've tried to give some advice to politicians, even to troubled politicians, uh, which has also had a certain cost attached to it. You don't want to appear on some people's radar, especially some people that can be dangerous, or dangerous, not necessarily in the overtly dangerous sense, but dangerous in the sense of the problem of creating collateral support. I mean, it's problematic when you are trying to create a better situation for people when at the same time you're in a fundamental disagreement with someone's way of life. It's a hard line to draw. Um, anyway, this kind of stuff gets very touchy to talk about because this is almost like very strange deep state type things. Um, and it gets more and more crazy. It only gets more and more crazy. But to someone that has no reputation, uh, that's a problem solver, that's a fixer, everything's a nail. And now I wonder if the world will tolerate me slightly trying to modulate my role in things. But in some sense, I do actually think that they don't have a choice to a large extent. If they know enough, they'll know enough to watch out about crossing me, and I realize that that might seem quite impotent to some people. Um, what am I talking about? What am I referring to? Uh, but I mean, in some sense, this is a bit. This sounds like crazy, conceited sort of hubristic bullshit in some sense, but I mean, I don't know if people believe, that there's going to, in some sense, everything that I do is very finely tuned towards is very finely tuned towards. Okay, sorry, I can't think of the word. What is the word that means to stop something from happening? Adver, adverting, averting thermonuclear third world war. Uh, everything is very finely tuned to cataclysm. If it's not just massaged the right way, in some sense, you get witches, you get wizards, and you get warlocks, and really, in the Hogwarts school, I am, let's say, the principal of the warlocks, and I have warlocked this world down with my interventionism, with my crafty interventionism. Everything is so finely tuned that it's only going to go well if everything goes in the right spirit in some sense. But anyway, and this has been a very hard thing to do because things are always changing. And the problem is, and let me just revisit what I was saying in the last recording, because now perhaps I have the subject matter to bring it up again. That the real problem is between the masochists and the sadists. Is what happens when you don't even realize that your own culture has a kind of masochism, a kind of a complex of, I mean, in some sense this happens as well between, especially in even human sexual relations between men and women, between the gender divide or something like that you get this unholy piece of, inverted borderline personality disorder, that men have to put up with this while women think that they actually have like a decent metric of scanning for, in some sense, the man is taking on, let's say, the archetypal female role, and the woman is taking on the archetypal male role. And because they're doing this, they've kind of hacked the ordinary gender convention, and it's often very useful to go against conventions, because conventions will inculcate within them their own toxicity. And so in some sense you end up creating an inverse counter toxicity that has an internal integrated balance between itself. And so in some sense you end up creating a microcosm, a very vibrant microcosm of that in a micro scale inculcates everything that macro has gone wrong. So in some sense you end up creating a break. You end up creating a break in the field circuit, and you personalize the psychological politics in culture at large, or something like that. Now, people that do this are in some sense, each culture has this variant within it, has this strain within it, which is why, there. It's interesting it's probably in Deuteronomy or something like that. I must say I'm not very incredibly clued up on Christian and Judaic structures and things like that, but I know that there's something of a prohibition. I think it's spoken of in the parable of the prodigal son and such, that you should be wary about falling in with foreign women, because when you are attracted to a foreign woman, you don't know how much of it is up to the woman in particular, and how much of it is just, let's say, that your form of cultural sadism or masochism is finding comfort with their form of cultural corresponding, say, masochism, or in some sense the magnetic attractiveness might be that in some sense you are so culturally programmed, each of you, that you are just finding a home for your cultural for your cultural tacit inculcated, sort of disposition, so much so that you're not even relating to the other individual. You're not even creating a union that is based on an individual understanding and insight into the other person, because you're actually just corresponding to them as a representative of a kind of a cultural program which you find a lot of comfort from. Now, that what I just said should not be taken as a prescription by any means, because in some sense, especially in the world that we live in now with multiculturalism to some degree, um, depending on which, I mean, if you take the non-racialist 90s version of multiculturalism, I think that you can actually have a real relationship with people from a foreign culture very, very easily, because you learn about the culture as you learn about the individual, and then you break that, you recontextualize the individual in a completely fresh sense. And in some sense, then you've got new eyes on the situation, because you're actually evaluating it in the present time. You're actually creating a new reality bubble, which is very strong and independent, as it were, and you're choosing and negotiating your own values. But in some sense, this is what I think every marriage should have this attached to it. And and it can also be dangerous when you think, oh, well, we're from the same culture, we have the same values. No, no one has the same values, even if they think they do. But there are, let's say, difference in style, in conventional stylistic understanding of what values are. Let's say there are broad brush strokes that are cross-culturally in different styles and different forms. And so there can be, let's say, almost like an inculcated predisposition around that, which people don't even know that they have about themselves, or something like that. But anyway, this is, I think, is a danger in having, let's say, low quality, superficial type codependency, developing codependency rather than an authentic relationship. Anyway, what's my point about this is that, so the microcosm of the family, which in some sense is the union, at least in the context of having a family that has children, that is procreating, um, the union of a man and a woman in some kind of family structure, in some kind of system that has to make sense, or something like that. I mean, the smallest number of components is a man and a woman, essentially, at least in the biological part of it. Sorry, I'm just trying to think in my mind how to rail against the kind of that you're not being inclusive enough, or something like that. I mean, in some sense, what I've just said, I don't mean to necessarily negate sperm banks or something like that, or surrogate people and then donation of something in some sense, but or adoption. But in some sense, those things also had a man and a woman at the beginning of the story. It's just that then through the filter of the sperm bank, or through the filter of the adoption agency, that is the story of someone's family makeup. But it did all start with a man and a woman, essentially. Um, Still. So anyway, but in some sense, and obviously things are going to be substandard. Not everyone is going to have a stable family structure, but in some sense, having some kind of account for what, let's say, a good, um, you know, states and governments should really start caring about the health of the family more, and maybe not actively, but indirectly try to promote the life of the family, but not try to legislate or whatever. I mean, I've put this through in another sort of thing, that in some sense, the most important thing to have in society is a dream, is a positive opportunity that people can orientate themselves towards. Um, to a large extent, what's destroying the dream in Western society is the fact that people want more and more wages because the buying power of their money is bleeding away at at an almost at an uncontrollable escalating rate. And it's interesting how society used to be run. In some sense, people were not expected to plan out their spending in a month. They were paid weekly. They paid their rent weekly. There was this very keen sense of the entrepreneurial spirit, because you were paying everything weekly. Every all the turnover had to happen weekly, so you could get a very clear sense, I guess, if you were breaking even or not. The barrier to entry into supplying a niche for a market was was much lower. Now everything is licensed and rent attached to it. You can't just be a street vendor. uh, um, you know, it used to be that when you complained about something not being available, that was a niche for a new market that you could maybe try to earn money through engaging in. But essentially the general cost of living is so. I mean, in some sense, I think this is the problem in society: is the cost of living. It's not that the wages are too low; it's that the cost of living is too high, and it doesn't get reduced because of the imbalance and such. But anyway, is the Leviathan has grown too large. But and to a large extent, that's because the individual citizens no longer have the power to rectify problems themselves. They depend on the largesse of the state to protect them through regulation, because they can't protect themselves, which I think an egregious problem in some sense, because functions that are now being used, that essentially the government supposedly has to do, should be made accessible. Just having a justice system, a legal structure, uh, to litigate out controversy and claims. But anyway, I've spoken for far too long, and I've kind of lost my own thread, perhaps. Um, I was talking about sexuality to describe how. Let me go back and clean up what I said about Germany maybe two recordings ago. What I'm trying to say about when I criticize Germany in the way that I do, and when I try to link that to children, the abuse that happens to children, the kind of abuse that I'm talking about is a very subtle form of abuse. What I'm trying to say is that, in the same wise, in the phrase and in the framing of that, there's a perennial trade-off between providing sympathy to people and allowing a people to be self-sustaining in some sense. And when you, let's say, how Germany operates is that they don't make their own law organically, they field it out to the world. They use elites and experts to go out to far afield to work out what the best practice should be, and then they kind of collate it, and they tabulize it within their own legal structure, and then they just pass it as a kind of Napoleonic decree through their legislature. That's how they do things. It's very, very efficient. Now, what happens if the whole world functioned like that? It wouldn't function unless you had created some kind of computer simulation, or you got some people together to imagine how, and kind of did mock trials or something like that to try to work out how to possibly expand the law, but essentially it wouldn't be able to innovate itself. So what I'm trying to say is that within German society, there will be a spirit of leadership which is being repressed. That some people's personalities that actually want to have a justified understanding know that their German society is very, very efficient, know that their German society has a high level of functionality built within it, but that they somewhat know that it's not justified, because where does it come from? These people don't seem to properly know. They know the use of the value in having a high efficacious society, but they don't make it themselves. It's not self-made. And so the people that have the spirit of self-making things, of actually having the intuition to do it, the leaders of Germany in some sense go through a form of trauma and abuse. I'm trying to say that real leadership, in some sense, I mean, and the leaders of Germany are in a very precarious position because of history, because of culture, because of a lot of things. But they go through too much. They go through too many trials. The precarious nature of leadership in Germany is not justified in some sense. The leaders do too much. They are too good for their people. And that's not sustainable. And what I'm just trying to say is that actually how this injustice plays itself out is that it plays itself out against the young. That when the young people who have the spirit of independent critical thinking and leadership, when they grow up in a culture that treats them a certain way when they're in the wrong place at the wrong time, I guess you could say, when they have maybe the wrong parents, maybe when they have when they, because their culture itself doesn't need them. Elites fulfill that role. There's no organic place for these children, so they get repressed by their culture. That's what I was trying to talk about when I was. Sorry, this is a very long way of getting to that point, but essentially, this is the evil of and wickedness. Is that it is plagued. It is a plague that the children sit with, and in some sense, the only cure to that is, you could say, is through uplifting the parents to be better, to their children to some degree. But you can't just force parents to be better to their children. You have to actually, they have to want to be better to their children, and they have to believe that they're not being good enough or whatever. And that requires a whole lot of things that might not exist within culture. That requires a whole lot of shared values, a whole lot of cohesiveness, which perhaps doesn't exist. To a large degree, it doesn't exist in my country because everything has been frozen for 20 years because of the institutionalized corruption and the utter betrayal of the hope of the new South Africa, as everything has been bent towards corruption. I mean, it's just blatant political corruption in some sense that then has been mirrored in many different institutions and power structures, like the judiciary has conformed itself to this way of corruption, with the kind of corrupted jurisprudence. Anyway, and there's a very parallel thing that happens in American intellectualism. And I've kind of already spoken about it in these last few lectures or recordings of my voice. Anyway, let me finally put this recording finished, but I've gone through so many things. I feel that I must go back and clean up some of my statements, which are probably a bit confusing. I need to revisit Germany. I need to revisit calling myself a warlock, and contextualize these things. And I think that this all comes together, although I did try to really patch this up. I think I'll do a better job of it this time. So in the sense that I'm calling myself a warlock, I think everyone who has a false ego complex, who is active within field circuits, karmic field circuits, they are all in fact warlocks. They are all perpetrating some kind of trying to make themselves more comfortable in their own false ego complex, trying to situate themselves to be more appropriately uh, 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 contented, or you know within their field of what they see, and something like that. And in some sense, that's a natural drive to wish to sort of align your self-image of where you are in the field of possibility with your internal set of attitudes and such, and to the extent to which that your self-knowledge gives you an idea about how you should deploy yourself, how you should be in pursuit of a purpose, of a goal that you are trying. So within that, sadly, there is a lot of tacit confusion, there's a lot of inherited confusion, there's a lot of cultural things. So let me now talk about culture. So, because I do think that in some sense, what I would call toxic culture, the toxic culture of, or in the subculture of, uh, I don't actually know how to label this that well, but essentially the toxic Black American subculture, which is to a large degree, I think, it doesn't belong to black people. It has nothing to do with being black in some sense. It has more to do with absorbing a very toxic form of Cajun sort of French peasantry, which, Thomas Sowell has done work that essentially people, ebonics and things like that, how the black subculture speaks. This is got nothing to do with Africa. This has got to do with, in some sense, a very pernicious form of enculturation, which, quite frankly, I believe has its historical roots in a kind of French peasantry than it does with anything else, that could be called African or black. But anyway, and every people that has imbibed that culture has retarded themselves as a collective. And to a large degree, I think it can also be mapped as a gender thing. And oh my word, I should have researched this guy's name. This is going to be so embarrassing. But there are very intuitive, critical, independent thinkers who have decoded what this actually means in cultural sense. I think his name is Jamie Lee. Jordan Lee. I think it's Jordan Lee. I think his surname is Lee. Where he tries to give these hard lessons to men growing up in the black community, even, but men in general, because this is possible across the board. I can't actually remember the actual phrases that he uses, but I think he's really onto something where he says you have to mix up what he's saying with some jargon from Sam Vaknin. He would basically be saying you have to let go of the dead mother. You have to stop being oppressed by the dead mother. In some sense, the toxic black subculture to a large degree is centralized around essentially the welfare queen bee, and in some sense, the whole culture is made in the image of the cultural hegemon of the welfare queen bee, and they don't care that the masculine energy in the subculture is being completely disposed towards just creating useful rhetoric and propaganda to demand more resources be accorded to the welfare queen bee so that she can continue to do her very destructive and culturally pernicious, sort of program of self-aggrandizement at the expense to everything else, because everyone else must just be an identity. Everything must be set in its identitarian narrative so that just more responsibility and accountability can be delivered to catering and pandering to the demands and this and the and the neediness. Whenever there's a sacred victim, whenever there's an identity that you're just not allowed to question, it's always a good idea to look underneath the sympathy that is being granted wholesale or without question to something. Now, I do think that is how that toxicity is essentially orientated. That in some sense, because the welfare queen bee cannot be blamed for her own situation and must just be placated, must just be granted and bestowed whatever she so demands and believes is fair. And so you can't even get like an actual culture that even has healthy gender relations or healthy sexual relations, because all those things must then be foisted off on the outgroup. Now, I will say that the American situation is slightly complicated because you do have a shady, corrupt political scene in government, right? You do have that. But that doesn't mean that more damage isn't being caused by the culture themselves. And the kind of divisiveness that exists within culture means that you can't even vote for the correct candidate that's actually fixing the problems on a structural level. I mean, famously, Trump essentially got I would say voted out of office because he's a racist. That is the message of why Trump couldn't continue to be the president, is because he's a racist. I mean, how does that make any sense? It makes perfect sense if you understand, well, he was unsettling the narrative that the welfare queen bee is dependent on, and he lost. And the Democrats won, and the big tech narrative won at trumping up essentially the reinforcement of that very toxic status quo, which I would say is a mirror reflection of the plutocracy, is a mirror reflection of the elite takeover or whatever. And so, in some sense, if you do want to get rid of Trump and you're on the left, I would say that in some sense you're just like those far right wing lunatics that are what you would call accelerationists. That they want the apocalypse to look like it's more here and now, so that we can have a more radical shift into something that's going to fix everyone's problems. And I'm an anti-accelerationist. I want to fix the default system so that we have the space and the luxury to actually create a real alternative that has real integrity rather than a one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter solution. Now, this is, I think, part of the problem, because although that is what I've just described stops people from being individuals in some sense. People with this kind of toxic subculture depersonalize themselves to such a degree, it's disgusting, that they can't even operate, because they just have to be part of the narrative, that is adjunct to the queen bee welfare narrative, or whatever. And everyone just has to be, let's say, a pet of that a consortium of never-ending, self-fueling, self-prophesying sort of doom spiral. It's very debilitating. It's very self-disempowering. So how do you say, no, sorry, your culture is just so toxic, leave it, or just stop regarding yourself as being a part of it, break away from it and become something else? And so the rebels in the black subculture, and I mean the real rebels, the ones that actually say, no, I'm not putting up with this. Well, if you say that I'm not black when I don't go along with this, then fine. Then I'll just be a non-racialist. My identity will then novate into a non-racialist category, because I'm not going to be a part of this madness. I'm not going to be a part of this insanity, just so that you can essentially demand more resources on behalf of welfare queens that are destroying the system, because I've looked underneath the unquestionable sympathy that must be granted to these women that are essentially keeping us in this lowest common denominator scenario. So all the things that you're not allowed to question because of sympathy. Now, in Germany, you have almost the inverse problem, because in Germany, the leaders and the elite have to sympathize with the masses. And this means that the rebels, the cultural rebels in German society, are very toxic people, ironically. So, in some sense, in the black subculture, the rebels are the salt of the earth. In Germany, the rebels are often, now, I guess I have to say this twice, because there are two types of rebels. You get the rebels that are resisting, culturally resisting, but then still have to embed themselves somehow in the narrative. So what they end up doing is they end up attacking foreigners. They end up being, they end up sort of having this inferiority complex about people on the outside, and they end up with this vitriol that they have to pour out over someone. You Domkopf, how can you just not do the right thing? How can you just not already anticipate what it is that's in my head? Because I don't know how to communicate. Because my culture has all this inbuilt sympathy that the leader and the elite give to the people, that none of my society makes sense. Because it's not organic, it's not fluid, it's not built culturally from brick and mortar up. It's imposed top directed. It's imposed from the top down. And in some sense, that is in some sense what the welfare queens are demanding in some sense. And people that have a certain amount of sustainability in their mentality, or they have a certain kind of intuitive thinking, they say, yeah, well, those are the people that become the salt of the earth, let's say, rebels to the black subculture, because they say, yeah, the kind of utopia that you are demanding will not be a utopia. It will be an infantilism, and also it won't be a culture that I would recognize or dignify, or that I wouldn't have integrity in it, because in some sense everything would be doled out according to some quota, according to some generalized conventionalized expectation. And in some sense the natural leadership, that's what I was talking about when I was saying that the culture in Germany has this inbuilt child abuse in it. And I mean that in a very subtle way. I don't mean that like every child is being abused. I mean that people that have a certain personality profile are going to grow up in German society, and they're going to say, this culture does not deserve the efficiency that it has built within it, because it does. The people don't understand it. It's not part of the people. It's being imposed from the top down. And I rebel against that because I'm not just going to follow the authority. I want it to make sense. I want it to actually, why are you just telling me something, but you can't justify it in your understanding to me? So you get these human beings, children that are sensitive, and they're growing up in a society that is unjustified in its meritoriousness, if I can put it like that, because they have a kind of inverted borderline personality disorder that their leaders have to be sympathetic to the plebs, and this means that there's no ladder for the plebs to actually grow in an organic sovereignty, or there's a tacit disease here, which I will say is taken out on children. This is a very sort of subtle thing, because then the rebels in the German society are the people that would be the natural leaders, perhaps. They are the people that would be naturally of high quality, but they have been turned rotten by a culture that has no place for them, because their role is being obfuscated or being displaced by this sympathy which it is demanded that the leaders must pour out onto the lowly plebs. And so, in some sense, Germany is the calcification of the peasants are revolting, but we love them anyway. And in some sense, the identity politics in America, in some sense, is that kind of solution to the problem, as it were, which is that we don't want to be individuals, we just want to enjoy something, or something like that. And we're allowed to have these demands because we can cherry pick our history, we can cherry pick the sources of our discomfort, and we can say that they all exist outside of our community, not inside of our community. So we are not the chefs, or I can't remember the phrase, we are not the makers of our own discontent, because there are other people that have made us uncomfortable. Therefore, we get a free ride at demanding justice, social justice, because we don't own our own dysfunction. So they both have unconsciousness in them. The one is somewhat trying to take an easy way out, because they're like, look how easily we can kind of portray ourselves as historical victims. Therefore, we don't have to actually understand the actual history of the problems in the black community, because we can just say, oh, it was all because of redlining. Forgetting the fact that actually there's nothing in America that stops you from going to a different neighborhood, from like literally, making maybe some money or something like that, selling your house at a discount, because obviously, a discount relative to the sense that, well, if your neighborhood has been redlined, then the property value growth of your property in such a red line district is not going to do as well as other properties, but essentially you get out and you move somewhere else. So in some sense, the whole racialist cries for demanding justice in America has nothing to do with people of color. It has to do with geography, because somehow there's a cursed land. There are these cursed islands in America called red line districts, but there's nothing stopping you from not living in one of those cursed lands, if you want to say that there's this chain history. So in some sense, what is the problem? Is the problem that people have this memory that this area was redlined, that they can't forget it, that they don't want to forget it, that they don't want to turn a new leaf or something like that, they don't want to turn over a new page, so that they can just keep on remembering, well, this district was redlined. And then they don't blame themselves for not getting out of that district, because it used to be redlined. And so they say, well, now it used to be redlined, so now it should look the same as every other district. Rather than saying, well, am I the same person here? Could I just move to a different place? So you have this whole chain of, let's say, lazy narrative reductionist sociological, because the idea is that if you can claim the symbolic oppression, then you can get the claim of a kind of symbolic power that is owed to you by the system, and therefore you don't have to do anything anymore. You don't have to be an active participant. You don't have to be an individual. You can just be this part of this moral consideration that exists as a category which the moral category of the group is more important than the moral category of the individual. And so you've actually created a culture that is literally anathema to the soul, I would say. And in some sense, then you kind of fall into this lowest common denominator of I mean, because this is, as a generalization, this is how women see society. I mean, and I'll explain why they see society in this way. They see the society in this way is because it's the easiest way for a woman over anthropological evolution or whatever to not rock the boat in a society. When you are a woman in a society, you if you want to have healthy children, which is obviously good for passing on your genes, you want to do so in relatively short order. You don't want to have children in your 30s. You want to have children sort of in your mid-20s as kind of like almost the cut-off for optimization of children or something like that. Obviously, we've probably extended that to some degree in modern society because of better nutrition and better health, perhaps, or potentially, at least. Also, there are other toxins and pollutants and things like that that make it harder, but essentially, women have much more delicate biological constitutions, and let's say they come into this world with a pro-social biological capital, which men do not have. Men are disposable relative to women. And so women have a lot riding they have a lot riding on their decision to make a family unit or to be part of a family unit, and they also have a disproportionate power, cultural power, that men do not have. Men only gain cultural power from, let's say, the competence hierarchy or from being high status or something like that. Which in some sense they also have to own themselves, otherwise they're not really considered to be real men in some sense. They're just kind of, anyway, man, I don't, there's so many issues here, but I do feel I have to cover some of this stuff. But essentially, there is an asymmetry within sexual relations because sperm is cheap, eggs are expensive, and there's a sell-by date on a woman's eggs, and men can generally still be fertile because they're not the ones that are incubating and gestating the new generation. So in some sense, if a woman's health deteriorates, that can mean that she can perhaps never have children again. Men can lose their health and regain their health. Men can lose their fertility and regain their fertility. So anyway, there's lots of asymmetries here, biological asymmetries. And what that essentially rounds that out to is that women will judge men based on their wallet, based on their purse to some degree, and men will judge women based on biological things, which means that the character of a woman is somewhat doesn't matter too much, but women are judging the character of men. Now that's a bit of that's a gross oversimplification, because also you need to watch out that women have, if women can change culture, they will into a hypergamous kind of, like women will optimize their power within culture, and they have ample ability to do so because women will often set cultural conventions. Women will control culture to a large degree. Any way that they can control culture, they will control it in some sense, because they just need to align themselves as a block. And so women have this trick where they don't act as an individual, they act as a woman. This is almost the motif of feminism, is that as a woman we have this demand. Deal with it. Do unto this new standard which we are modeling to you. And we as women, as a collective in women within your culture, have decided this is the new standard. Meet it. This is what women are used to doing. This is how they operate the kind of cultural politics. Because and the cultural trade-off is that you can do that, woman, but then don't get involved in actual politics. Don't get involved, because in some sense what politics has to do is it has to meet your cultural demands. So men said, look, well, perhaps you shouldn't get the vote then, because we have to vote about how to create hard structures so that men are capable of delivering to women what they demand as a block from us. Now, if you want to join the male experience and you want to become an individual like us, then become an individual like us, And but then put down the collective block voting in culture that you are perpetrating. And in some sense, even when men try to mirror the same thing, just to try to tell women that they're being unreasonable, they even mitgau, men going their own way. What do they do? Do they try to force it on women that women understand how unreasonable they're being? No. What does mitgau do? It says it's like Gandhi, it's like non-violent. It's like, we're just going to not date you anymore. We're going to swear off of you. We're just going to leave you alone because you're too fucking toxic. So even when men try to replicate what women do to men or what women do to society and culture, men don't. Men still are more sensitive when they do it. Men are still more level-headed when they do it. And you're going to say that the juveniles that come up with toxic memes and that they say these horrible things about women. Well, yeah, I mean, juveniles are going to be more radical. Juveniles are going, and in some sense, these are people that are just waking up to their own sexuality. I mean, imagine being a 14-year-old boy and you actually do understand cognitively, you do understand reasonably that your whole fucking culture, the sexual mores of your culture, is controlled by a group of women who are making themselves unhappy just because they're misanthropic. That's how fucked up culture is. You know, I mean, to put a political narrative on this, Trump, as far as I can see, does everything in the right direction, does everything correct, and then he gets voted out. If he was voted out, in fact, I mean, I do actually think that the the whole the numbers are really quite questionable. I would say the strange statistical steps and things like that. But anyway, and just how much there was that. I mean, if the if the if there was no fraud in the voting, why were there so many irregularities of stopping people from observing the vote counting? It doesn't make sense. That is just way too fishy. But anyway, let me move on from that. But my analogy with Trump is that he's literally doing the right thing, but just because the narrative is the mainstream narrative in mainstream journalism is that you can call him a racist and you can decontextualize everything that he says while not even ever showing real clips and context of what he says. I mean, they literally said that he said that there were good people on both sides and that meant he was talking about the KKK. I mean, that's like, all you have to do is listen to the whole press conference and you realize that was nothing what he was saying. And how many times was that repeated? Even by the Fox News moderator asking the questions, essentially repeated that insinuation, or not even an insinuation, that blatant lie, essentially was repeated, that tacit misinformation. So it's crazy. I mean, if that's not systemic corruption, I don't know what is. But that you can literally just suppress and change reality just by reporting on it in a certain way, consistently across the board or something like that. Anyway, because it's so hard to penetrate through this shell of essentially, well, I'm an identity, I have a lived experience, and let's not look at anybody else's lived experience, that pepper their lived experience with reason and rationality, where they don't just say, well, I have these cherry-picked experiences and that means XYZ and put up with my demands. They actually structure their lived experience with rational understanding and open inquiry and self-reflection, and a modicum of humility that allows them to change their perspective, as it were. And so, I mean, this is the problem, I would say, with the so-called black subculture, is that it is so programmed to be resilient to questioning itself, that it has no, uh, I mean, these are people that have depersonalized themselves. It's crazy. I mean, it's so toxic. I mean, and you can't expect other people to crawl on over broken glass just to satiate the kind of sadistically edged mentality, so in some sense, it really is a blue moon when you can maybe find, I mean, it's easier maybe that you can get your point across to a white liberal, but an actual, let's say, identitarian leader of this toxic movement, it's you might as well be playing Russian roulette, because if you try to penetrate their defense mechanism. And I mean, even the academics talk about having an anti. I mean, I saw once Slavoj Žižek was giving a lecture to obviously some kind of small class, and the person who was introducing him literally said, you're going to hear things that are not going to work according to our ideology. Please keep your missiles ready so that you can intercept and destroy the anti, I can't remember what they're called, but like anti-air missiles to shoot down the judgments that are coming that are going to disrupt your ideology. Make sure that you keep on shooting them down. It's like, I mean, this is Nazi philosophy 101. This is Nazi indoctrination. uh, it's crazy. It's completely, it's antithetical to anything. Um, anyway, I'm going. Okay, so what's the? Okay, now I've sort of lost myself because there are other important themes here that are worth bringing up. But I mean, what I just hate about it is that it's antithetical to actually solving the problem. Even um, is that the whole thing is a diversion. And it allows you to also completely forget about how things actually work in reality, and it allows you to just kind of pontificate about some kind of strange sociological generalization. I mean, we were having very nice progress in the 90s. Women that wanted to, women that were capable to, could do whatever they wanted to do. And essentially, just because of the complaint that statistically there wasn't parity, that somehow there was some kind of inbuilt systemic oppression, because half of philosophers weren't women, or half of engineers weren't women, or half of garbage collectors weren't women. Oh, no, wait, actually, that one they didn't care about. They didn't care that half of women weren't, painters, and half of women weren't handymen. Uh, I guess it's even in the name, handy men, because only a man would essentially do those kinds of odd jobs or something like that. Women don't want to be an odd job; they just want the high status. And I will say that this is because of the asymmetrical sexual thing. Women like shiny things. They like high status. They like, because that to them is minimizing their opportunity cost. If they can put themselves in a place where they are going to be brushing shoulders with people who are of high status, then they are well connected. They are perhaps well positioned in terms of the general, like, let's say, operating procedure of hypergamy, which is, like, this is why women go out to nightclubs, because the dream is that they'll come across a celebrity, a very rich celebrity, that will sweep them off their feet and say, "I love you," and then they will, it's like playing, it's like gambling. It's like when you go to the casino, do you play the table where you can only double your money, or do you put it in the slot machine where you can kind of get a million return on what you put into the machine? It's that kind of, that's the problem with hypergamy, is that where does it end? Because even, let's just say you've gone to the casino and you've done fairly well. You've quadrupled, you more than quadrupled your money. You went in with $10 and you walk out with 10, and you could walk out with $10,000. Do you stay or do you go? That's the problem with hypergamy, is when does it end? Because it's in pursuit of what? It doesn't already have a fixed target. It just wants to maximize comfort or something like that. This is the problem that Germany has. This is also the inbuilt problem of what, it doesn't have a proper outlook in some sense. It's just trying to maximize utility for what? For what? For what? And it's in some sense the only way that you can actually say that, well, why are you maximizing utility? It's because of envy. It's because otherwise my girlfriend, she got a guy who has everything, And I only got a guy who has some of those things. That's the only way that you can ground hypergamy, is in this kind of, well, every I want free drinks for the rest. In some sense, that's what the modern time is. It's that women tell themselves, some women get free drinks every time they go to the bar. Other women get free drinks less of the time, and then all the free drinks stop when you get older. That's unfair. I want free drinks. I want every woman should have equal access to free drinks. Otherwise, it's not fair. That's social justice in a fucking nutshell. It's that fucking stupid. It's that superficial. Never mind who's paying for these free drinks. There's no such thing as free drinks. Free drinks is the money earned by men, garnered by men, gifted to women by their choice. Now men are not allowed to have choices. They're not allowed to have their own discerning. They're not allowed to have their own judgment. So this whole movement is made on essentially depersonalizing, dehumanizing men and the decisions that men make. Men are not allowed to be deliberate, so that we can explore this very parasitic sexual program of undermining human sexuality and displacing it with a kind of a perverse ideological Tower of Babel that we call social justice. So that some people can generalize what men should want, instead of actually, if you don't like what men want, then fucking convince them otherwise. Then go up to a man and say, oh, is that what you like? Why do you like that? Why do you like that? I mean, it's a psychological thing. It's more of a psychological thing than anything else. I mean, yes, they're going to have their own sexualization history of, when I was 10 years old, a girl was nasty to me and this is what she looked like. So I always just associated nastiness with girls that kind of look like that, maybe. And maybe the reason why the girl was nasty is because she thought that she was unpopular because all the other girls with this color hair were popular and she was unpopular because of that color hair. So it's like a chain of toxic expectation and conventional symbolism or whatever. But there are people that are, let's say, gems, and I have this whole thing about positive sexuality, which is, look, when I was 21, I'm 34 years old. When I was 21 and at university, this is my story. My story is that women in general are, most of them are just beyond civilization. When I say that, they're beyond maturation. They don't see themselves as human beings. They see themselves as greedy, hypergamous, sort of envy-driven, resent-driven, high-status seeking. They're not people. They're not personable. Most women have so much of this built into them because people are nice to them when they're growing up. They give women sympathy unquestioningly. And so it's not their fault to some degree that they didn't develop a character, that they didn't develop any kind of sense of who they are, because everyone was just trying to validate them. This is what I would call, what's her name? The Hermione Granger, the actress, not the character. I'm talking about the actress who played in the Harry Potter movies. This is this kind of toxic feminism in some sense. The idea that, like, because she wanted to set the rules of the game with the other boys, and the other boys thought that she was being unilateral and too bossy, and she thought that she was just being as much as a boy as any other boy because she was essentially modeling toxic masculinity, and because she didn't get away with it, she just doubled down into it. But there are other ways of looking at this as well, which is that essentially also what I was trying to get into, or was trying to move into, is that the ugly ducklings are generally, I'm grossly generalizing because this is not true as well, but essentially the ugly ducklings to a large extent are the ones who actually have a real character, because the ones that were ugly in high school and then they developed a real humanity, they developed a real character because they weren't just bestowed certain things, they weren't just given props or whatever. They had to actually work at their relationships to some degree. Obviously that can go both ways, because if you have to work at your relationships and then you're resentful that other women don't have to work at their relationships, then you almost double down and you become a doubly toxic person, because not only do you not get the attention that you crave and that you demand or that you expect, because it's unfair that you don't get it, but then you also never learn the skills that you were in the opportunity of developing being in this, let's say, uncomfortable, peculiar position. But instead of owning your peculiarity and trying to make the best of it, you double down on your reticence, you double down on your resentfulness, and you become, let's say, an avatar. So this is the misanthropic feminine archetype in some sense. This is the devouring mother in some sense. This is the beginning of borderline personality disorder as well, I would even say, in some thematic sense. And this happens because essentially you have female role models, which are all, let's just say, perhaps I mean, you see, at some point you can't blame other people. You can't just say, well, it's the lack of female role models. At some point, people do actually decide their own conscious schema. They do actually develop their own thinking. Um, and to some degree, men or boys might have a leg up than girls because boys um, have a lot of testosterone coursing through their brain, but also which gives them, let's say, a bit of a more chutzpah. It gives them a little bit of a higher drive to go and experiment. So men can go and experiment and then maybe find, oh, I found a solution to my own problem. Whereas women don't have that same testosterone when they're very, very young, experimenting, but then they are doing it with their thinking. So in some sense, women do need to be more studious when they are young. They need to be exposed to more models. They need more stories. They need more narratives. Boys can create their own narratives. I'm grossly generalizing. And this is why it's also good for boys and girls to play together at a very young age. And I would say that the girls that I used to play with learned a lot from me because I exhibited a lot of, let's say, the potential to construct narrative, the potential to create narrative at will in order to appropriately deal with situations. And in some sense, it was interesting because I divided the girls that knew me to some degree or that knew of me indirectly because they were kind of two camps. They were the section of the girls who couldn't countenance that level of fluidity, and they kind of hunkered down into a cabal because they were like, no, this strategy is not going to be good for us. I created a lot of philosophical waves around me, so I had, let's say, people who appreciated me and people who saw me as almost like an ideological threat to how they become successful women. And in some sense, this was even part of the zeitgeist of the 90s. And to some degree, just on a micro scale, in terms of the peers that I had growing up, in the community that I had growing up, I mean, in some sense, not being able, I mean, I wasn't trying to proselytize to people. I wasn't trying to convert the people who didn't appreciate me, as it were. Um, in some sense, they didn't disappreciate me. They didn't unappreciate me. They just kept their distance to some degree because you gravitate towards what goes for you, and you let's say you repel yourself against that which doesn't go for you, in some sense. And so maybe you come from a culture in which things are more conventional and traditional, in which the individual does not, is not the king of their castle, as it were. So, and in some sense, I mean, South Africa is a very diverse place. In some sense, I do think that what I was crossing was the Germanic influence in culture, that the people who were more influenced by the Germanic tendency of organization within culture knew that I portended to them something that was disruptive to their etiquette, to their decorum, to their cultural structure. Anyway, I do think that there is something to be said that in essence, the welfare queens of America and the black subculture would much prefer to be adopted by the Germanic form of statism in some sense. In some sense, that is their wish, that is their demand, that is their dream, that is the kind of political leadership that they want. Because they don't want to be accountable for voting for the right person. They just want to be delivered the goods. So they want to give up their sovereignty in order to gain efficiency and efficacy or something like that. And they don't want to think about it. That is a dangerous, unsustainable, slippery slope, I will say that at the very least. And in some sense, this is all that anyway. But that's, so again, I'm just kind of, I'm just elaborating on this perennial trade-off between sympathy and sustainability. And I also describe how Germany isn't sustainable in the last recording that this will probably be appended to. So yeah, a lot of these things have psychological roots to them, have individual roots to them. Anyway, and to some extent, we need to grow up and learn to be more evolved and more in culture, or to have a higher culture, to have a better culture. I mean, and I'm a bit of an apostle on that level, but in some sense, I do think that the way I don't expect people to do what I suggest to them, but I do want to storm the castle of psychology and make everyone in psychology agree with me, because I do think that what I say, I mean, now I'm not giving substantial, I'm giving a narrative to some degree, but I do think that everything that I say can be justified within true psychological modeling and understanding. Um, and it is technically true that there are other ways to structure a society, but I don't think that, at least if you're going to have a subject called psychology, it doesn't make sense to have, let's say, a fake psychology. It doesn't make sense to have a psychology that actually doesn't make sense. I mean, it might be true that if you correctly understand psychology, you could, on a technical level, say, well, yes, if you could have a society that just had these personality types in those combinations, in those roles of leadership, then they could have a society that had this kind of ideological structure to it, and they wouldn't know the difference between that and anything else. But it just so happens that I don't think that you can really control for people's personalities within, unless you're going to have a kind of diabolical sorting hat that makes it so that you can control people in a very dehumanized way. You know, and it is true that certain cultures or certain are differently numbered. In some sense, I think that, because that's why people will migrate to a different culture. That's why people see themselves as outliers and they're dissatisfied. But there is, there I do often have a lot of admiration for the rebels in any culture, the people that are malcontented, but they are not malcontented and rebellious in a resistance type way. They are in a cognitive type way. They are meditating on it. They are philosophizing about it. They are searching for the truth because they have found a mystery that they want to understand. And then what is at the end of that rabbit hole is unlocking real knowledge, unlocking at least the ingredients of a greater liberation for all of us, perhaps. And sadly, how much of this has had to be reinvented and rediscovered because we live in such a toxic culture that can't even hold on to its own treasure because it doesn't know what treasure is, because it's too busy with its masochism and its sadism trying to kind of harmoniously balance itself um, within its iniquity, within its wickedness. But yeah, I'm really not proselytizing for wholesale reform. In some sense, uh, when people have constitutional crises, when people have political crises, I mean, I have given my views and my advice on that. And when people have problems in their society because of false authority, because the psychology has got it wrong, well, I have a lot of work to do to update psychology, I think. Hopefully my models, I think, will be the new basis of a psychological field. Anyway, uh, okay, now I've babbled on enough, but I think I covered everything that I wanted to cover. Because in some sense, what we're dealing with is that woman and culture has regressed. People forget how on track we were in the 90s and just how much retrograde devolution we've had in the culture, because essentially women took a second take on it. They're like, no, actually we don't want to be liberated, we just want our demands met. Actually, we like that strategy more. And in some sense, that's also what happens in Weimar Germany. I mean, the female component of Nazi philosophy, they drove the culture completely. It was a completely feminine driven affair. I mean, what made Nazi culture successful were the women. They were the ones who compelled compliance with identity politics in Weimar Germany, essentially. And yes, they also had a contingent of useful idiots, as Hitler would call them, the proto-fascists, the people who would march hand in hand with the Nazis, but would not call themselves Nazis, who wanted a more um, generalized liberation, and so the kind of the more, I call them proto-fascists because they have the same fascistic worldview. They just believe that it's possible to have a rainbow Hitler, essentially. But it anyway. These are kind of interesting points, but I don't wish to just kind of continually complain about Germany, because in some sense, yeah, I mean, I see the modern German problem and Weimar Germany as in some sense, I mean, I think we have a lot of potential throughout the world to make huge progresses in consciousness. I think this crisis is a wonderful opportunity for us to finally immunize culture against fascism, because in some sense, the folk in Germany are not incorrect when they are demanding the things that they are demanding, but in some sense, the leadership in Germany is too good. They need to create a more organic self libertarian uh, self ownership and self governance on the individual scale within society. I mean, what I'm basically counseling is just remove the Napoleonic corruption from the hard structure, um, because the kinds of collective interests that the folk in Germany have, that, oh, there's too much immigration and it's weird and our culture is being threatened, all those things are true. But the weird thing is that they have no way to challenge it as an individual. You can't go to court as an individual and say, stop this policy. You can't do that. So what can they do? Well, they have to do it as a collective, because that's how the political system works. So that, to me, is the problem there, is that the libertarian interface with governmental power and policy is anyway. But you have to maybe make too many radical changes before you can kind of have that idea where essentially, because I mean, you can't question the governmental prerogative in the German political system. I believe you can in South Africa. The legal tradition is actually set up to do that because we have a supreme constitution, but we've also got a corrupted jurisprudence because everyone else in the world doesn't have that kind of liberal empowerment, which the government in this country has been destroying for too long now. I mean, the education system has we imported outcome based education when, after it failed in America. We imported a failed model to make education worse in this country, because I guess every time you change something, it's a wonderful opportunity to steal more money from the government coffers. So, you just, any excuse to change something just to look like you're doing your job when you're actually making things worse. It's awful. Just because some scholar in America can tell you, oh yes, it's better, go along with it. And how, I mean, I think I was told that they gave the public in this country a month to give testimony or to talk about outcome-based education before it basically became law. So essentially it's crazy. Complete betrayal of an open liberal democracy, but also in governmental terms. I mean, where's the accountability that you're going to make education worse in this country, and then you don't even own that? And well, I guess it's because maybe the education field is so lax, is so weak as a scholarly department in the academy, that, they're just so addled by identity politics that anything that allows you to spread identity politics, they're okay with. It doesn't matter that you're disempowering people by basically making them less educated, by giving them a worse education. Standards will never go up when you've got identity politics in, because in some sense, the more harm you do to yourself, the more you prove that your demands need to be just acquiesced to. Anyway, I'll stop this ranting. This is a bit annoying, this never-ending topic, which I don't want to drop because I feel like I haven't produced a balanced enough motif. There are lots of angles I could rework to sort of, but in some sense, I just want to say that, like, for example, there are magnificent German people who are kind of what I've described, that the naysayers, but essentially the quiet naysayers, the intellectual naysayers, the kind of, I've known a few different kinds, but essentially the classical liberal Germans that leave no stone unturned, that are searching for the answers. How, these are people that their minds are crucifying themselves looking for the answers, because they are performing this magnificent intellectual balancing act where they are doing a tight wire act on the edge of a knife, and if they slip either way, it's calamity, and they have to find this line, and find the answer. And that's a very magnificent and tricky thing to see. Someone who is, and it's interesting because in every culture, depending on the particular makeup of that culture, it's not that some people are evil. In some sense, some people are dislocated, because in another culture, their mentality would have been just the right antidote, perhaps. But because if you leave stones unturned, they weigh down the heart, as it were, and you're stuck with a leaden heart. There's some interesting things here which I'm going to start getting religious, I guess, if I go off on this. But the condition of the mind and the condition of the heart, these are things that I think in the ancient times were understood to not be distinct. That the heart of understanding was essentially what was meant when they referred to the heart. There was no weird belief that the brain was this powerhouse of intellect. The intuition was resident in the chest, in the heart. But anyway, not that the modern segregation of these concepts is not without its usefulness in some sense, which is something I think of a Newtonian invention, or perhaps even a Descartes kind of rationalist Cartesian sort of thing. But what's weird is that these identity politics people have got their own kind of they always say that, oh no, we're doing something that's more original, that's beneath the Enlightenment, that the Enlightenment was covering over, when in some sense they are actually more of a kind of reactionary antithesis to the Enlightenment that is doing much the same damage, just sort of in a new direction. Anyway, I'm saying all these things, but some people are, let's just say, very inopportunely placed, because in terms of their culture, and in some sense, you can still put blame onto these people, because in some sense you get inducted into tacit toxicity because you leave stones unturned. And it's only when you leave no stone unturned do you really have the mentality that I think can start to say that it's justified in its theories and conjectures and opinions, and working towards ever greater synthesis and carefulness in some sense, and seriousness and truthfulness, then you've kind of got those boxes checked if you are vigilant for the unturned stone and receptive towards it. But the idea that you're just going to sympathetically say as a category, well, no, there are stones there that haven't been unturned, and I'm not qualified to look under those stones. Well, now you've got a kind of a love of your own ignorance, a love of not understanding, kind of a categorical, never-ending excuse machine. But I wanted to say more almost religious things about the heart, but I was reading something recently, I guess, and I'm a little bit worried that I don't know what the quality of this text really is at the end of it, but metaphorically it seems to be very, very useful, but I wonder sort of how deep it will go, but I mean, I can see outlines that are very hopeful in some sense, or anyway, that it's the same kind of religious teaching that I'm familiar with, that when you homogenize everything into one paradigm, into, let's say, the intuition, which I think is essentially symbolically represented by the heart of understanding, that then you can deal in values, deal in reasoning in a very constructive sort of way, in a very subjectively justified sort of way. Obviously with always the caveat, I might be wrong, but everyone might be wrong, every subjective might be wrong, and there's no objectivity to attain to. And in some sense, all the different types of intuition that are possible are just sort of axiomatic characters. And in some sense, this is the realm of spirituality. This is the realm of, in philosophy, I think they call this intuition, something about, there's a section of philosophy where they try to say intuitionism, intuitiveness or something like that is you can't have intellectualism without intuition, essentially, which is, I think, a fancy way of saying you can't intellectualize without a faith, because without a faith then there's no way to delineate what's good faith and what's bad faith. And in some sense it's very tricky to argue about what is good faith and what is bad faith when you're dealing in someone who you regard to be in bad faith. And in some sense I like to pride myself that I can actually tolerate and even work with many, many, many forms of bad faith, but there are actually forms of bad faith which are impossible to disrobe, that are almost impossible to disarm, because they have so thoroughly abused themselves and depersonalized themselves and de-individuated themselves, and they love that darkness. And there's no, in some sense, you might be lucky, and you might be able to dig them out of that, or help them dig themselves out of that. But that's sort of, it's almost, this is the same kind of trap that borderlines set up. Borderlines, it's not that borderlines can't be helped. They might be helped. The problem is that I don't know how to put this, like, borderlines don't want to be helped. They don't want to be reached. They are committed to not being reached. And then they are committed to looking like they might be able to be reached. So then they force people to crawl over broken glass and towards this ever-retreating, booby-trapped field of, it's a form of ensnaring. It's a form of, it's a seductive form of entrapment. It's they essentially are trying to sow the field with a kind of intrigue, and if and this is the problem, in a world that will not stand by its own morality to some degree, to put up some fences, to put up some lines, or something like that, Uh, because, you know, if you want to believe, well, actually everyone's got something important to share, everyone is good, everyone is basically, you know, that's not going to cut it when you're dealing with something like borderline. It might be easier if you lived in a culture that was high functioning, because then you would be able to perhaps point to more examples to show how people were, or how borderlines were being uh, uh, self dissatisfied, let's just say, or anyway. So there are these, let's say, mentalities which are themselves conundrums and paradoxes within their own, let's say, and these are very tricky things to deal with, because in some sense you cannot handle them, because they're not about handling them correctly or incorrectly. In some sense, it's about demonstrating. In some sense, all you can really do is demonstrate the self deception, which they, in some sense, already know that they're self deceiving. So even that, the efficacy of that is questionable. But essentially, you have to basically say, I know what it is that you're doing. Uh, and I'm going to judge you for it, and I can forgive you for it, but then you have to stop doing it. And I'm not going to forgive you for it before you stop doing it. And you kind of have to put up hard boundaries against these people, because they are just fundamentally toxic. And and the more sympathy that you feed to them, literally the more control they take, the more power they end up, and this is why culture has gotten so toxic, is because we've gotten this very strange heuristic, this very strange algorithmic assumption that if someone is malcontented, it's because they've got a piece of the puzzle that they need to share, and they've got an important, and the less willing they are to share their piece of the puzzle, the more important their piece of the puzzle is. I say no, they don't have a piece of the puzzle, they have a negative piece of the puzzle. They have by their own illusion and projected delusion, they are actually painting other people's pieces of the puzzle dark, invisible. They are concealing other people's pieces of the puzzle. They, in some sense, need to be cordoned off to some degree. I mean, when I say cordoned off, I don't mean that they need to be locked up necessarily. I think that that's actually not a good solution. I think that we need to learn how to tolerate and cope with their kind of malfeasance, because then I think we have a culture that is actually enlightened, that is actually capable of protecting itself into immemorial times. We do have, we won't be victim to this core nexus of dysfunction which grows in the ways that it grows. I mean, okay, this follows on from my general contention that everything in culture is modeled from an individual's psychology to some degree. And so to the extent to which cultures are dysfunctional and societies are dysfunctional, it is because in some sense they have almost archetypal constituents and elements that have been confected in a particular combination, and there's an incongruence there. There's like a fundamental um, brokenness in that, and that you either need to integrate and add to it, or you need to remove from it to some degree. And sadly, in terms of hard structures of power, most of it is that you have to remove false authority, because there are very few things that function on a high level that are congruent, that are coherent, that are cogent, that are interfaceable by the rest of society. And in some sense, we have to actually sort of pitch towards the highest common denominator, not the lowest common denominator. Which is, I realize that that's not a very technical way of expressing it, but that is trying to get my point across in a bit of a poetical metaphor. Because when we dumb down the hard structure in our society, we are creating a captivation, we're creating an entrapment, an imprisonment of the soul. And we are also creating a whole secondary market for pseudo-intellectualism to peddle false promises and false solutions to that structural disintegration, which is gnawing at the end of the day, generally at children. At the end of the day, children get it in the neck. And this is the problem with children, is that children are not perfect. Children are not pure beings by any means. They need to have proper psychology modeled to them to some degree. They need the right amount of structure and the right amount of freedom. They need a lot. And in some sense, for a particular child at a particular time, it's not good to feed into their naive narcissism, because at some point you need to say, no, 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 you actually do need to rein yourself in. And sometimes, but so this is not something that can be prescribed in some way. And when you've got a culture that prescribes conventionally, and then that translates into the instruction or pedagogy of children, then you end up with enculturated passing on the corruption in some sense. And I mean, I've tried to give, well, I've given the German, what I think happens in the German society is that people who would be great natural leaders sort of are forced into becoming sort of rebellious twerps. And then you've kind of got the inverse of that, which is that, for example, I look, everything is a gross generalization when I talk on this level. It's just to get the understanding and the motif. But essentially, in the toxic black subculture in America, in some sense, the lowest common denominator is that you must become a rebellious twerp to fit into the toxic subculture. And in some sense, the real rebels to that are like the salt of the earth people who say, no, this is just toxic as hell. I'm getting out of here. I'm disassociating from this mess, from this toxic waste of a cultural mess that is so addicted and obsessed with its own systemic oppression, or whatever narrative that essentially just serves to entrench and to insulate. And again, when I call them welfare queens. When I say welfare queen, I'm not talking about people that are necessarily on welfare at all. I'm talking. It's more of an archetype. I mean, there are many of these people. I mean that in the cultural sense, because it's a bit of an amalgamation of a lot of things. I mean, in some sense, most welfare queens are probably not on welfare, but they probably are some kind of single mother, or they're a single mother that has a string of boyfriends or something like that, or they have children from different men, and such. That's what so when I say welfare queen, I'm not even talking about women that are dependent on welfare. But what I'm talking about is the kind of culture in which men are treated a certain way. Men are the value of men is somewhat subordinate to this narrative confection that just keeps on perpetuating this, this lowest common denominator sort of standard, which is not even capable of supporting a family unit in some sense. So it's not even. And a lot of people will say, well, this is all caused by integration. I don't think it's caused by integration. I think it's more so caused by the welfare state and integration simultaneously. And I think that integration would have been absolutely fine, but it was the increase in the welfare state along with integration that then created all these perverse incentives to destabilize the family. I mean, the black family in America had higher literacy than the general population. The black family in America had higher class mobility for a time. And that those trends probably would have stayed, because you see, what people forget about when they try to just say, well, slavery was terrible, was that not all slavery was actually as terrible as every other kind of slavery in some way. That some people were slaves to rich families that were actually, they kept slaves, but they didn't mistreat their slaves, although the whole thing is a disgusting imposition and it's inhuman. I will agree with that. But what I'm saying is that families that were the slaves of, let's say, very responsible people that just happened to be rich and happened to keep slaves and did so in a very humane kind of way, perhaps learnt a lot from their from their slave owners. And in fact, they learned the secrets of how to run a household. Perhaps they learned the secrets of class mobility. Perhaps they learned the secrets of how to advance oneself in society. Perhaps they encultured themselves because they were close to those who were in the elite in some sense. Perhaps some of that rubbed off in the black subculture, which then has gone through 180 degrees. Maybe that's why there was such a strong drive for black mobility. And without, let's say, the welfare state to kind of put a pin in that, in some sense, maybe a group of people in America that identify as black would have essentially been a more stable middle class as a constituency. But in some sense, I think it probably would have been mixed as well, because in some sense, in the South, that culture in the South is just so poisonous, is so toxic. And in some sense, the reason why there's so much racism in the black community itself, black people who are themselves disgusting racists, is because they have imbibed that French Cajun mentality, which is, the kind of, well, don't tell me about it and I won't ask and I'm superior, and don't tell me to go a different way. And, it's like, it's this kind of self-satisfied idea. And then if anyone looks like that, they look like that they're more high status than you, or if you're envious about anything, well, then you find a way to kind of take them down a peg, and maybe you lynch them or something like that. And although black people have been the victims of lynching, in some sense, the toxic black subculture in America is a culture that is so obsessed with trying to lynch a scapegoat for their own failures to some degree. And in some sense, using this iconical political problem, political corruption in society, that, oh yeah, there are some elites that are corrupt, so therefore we've got clean hands. This kind of false dichotomous thinking, which is ironic, because then when you actually have a politician that has record minority unemployment, who has been the biggest friend to minorities in America and the biggest friend to the working class, and actually has been sorting out things across the board, he gets voted out largely under the narrative that he's a racist. So, who is really the racist here? The people that have been plugging the narrative that Trump is a racist? I would say that they are the people who are very much clearly the real bigoted people, the real prejudiced people, who are not interested in actually fixing things on the ground. They're more interested in perpetuating their own ignorant narrative, because that's how they make sense of the world. Without the narrative, nothing makes sense. Without the scapegoating, nothing makes sense, because they are the ones who actually have the lynching culture that they are a part of, in some sense. And it has to do with this French fascistic peasantry. Look, I keep on blaming it on the French, and in some sense the American Revolution preceded the French Revolution, that I have suddenly educated myself in, because I don't even know the perfect timeline of these things. But anyway, to talk about it on a sociological level is very poisonous to some degree, because it gets us further removed from the actual solution of these things, which is understanding that at the end of the day, a culture as a whole will suffer from its inequity, and so it would be better for it to fix itself and to improve itself, and to do so with a spirit of openness and humility and intellectual integration. But I do have a problem. So I can't intellectually integrate with people who are abject fucking racists. What am I supposed to do with these identitarian fascists? What the fuck am I supposed to do? People that won't even fucking listen to me because of the color of my skin. Really, go fuck yourself. So excuse me for having my back against the wall, because you've put me up against the wall, you stupid fucking liberal racists, who think that, oh well, because because your sympathy, your endless well of sympathy that you're willing to dole out to people, because they must just be accorded some basic integrity when they have already given up their own integrity. They have sacrificed their own dignity for symbolic power because of wanting to attain to some symbolic pride, because that is how they categorize themselves as achieving some kind of dignity in the world, because they have reinterpreted dignity and integrity to basically be a power game, a zero-sum power game. I'm sorry that I can't deal with that. I'm sorry that I can't deal with that bullshit. And it sadly it takes too long. You can't disabuse them, because to disabuse them of that, they have to listen to you for 2 hours, and they're not going to listen to a white person for 2 hours. And to have to sit through their disgusting soliloquy of, oh yes, oh, they're going to give you so much racist, so much fascistic racist poetry that you have to sit through, because every time you make a claim, they will talk 4 times as long to try to get back to their narrative, because they've got a one-track fucking mind. Because that's how dehumanized they have done to themselves. And to point that out is not a simple thing to point out. That essentially that they have been played this narrative. Candace Owens is perfectly correct when she says that, yeah, you belong to the democratic plantation. I mean, that's one way of putting it, but I mean, there's a more ephemeral, subtle way of putting it, which is essentially the narrative in your culture is bullshit. And I'm not allowed to say that it's bullshit when it's absolutely fucking bullshit. You think I'm not being serious? You think I'm not being careful? I mean, I have deprogrammed people. I really have. It's too much work. It's actually not worth it in terms of my time, to tell you the truth. I mean, I've done it just to prove that I can do it in some sense, and it doesn't help, because now they're not friends with their friends. Now they can't go join their circles. You know, I've stealed them away from their bullshit culture. Now, you know, now they can't help it, because when they listen to this bullshit, they know it's bullshit. And they know that it's very hard to get through to these people who have been programmed with this fascistic nonsense. You know, so what can you do? And then there still are real problems which are similar to the problems that these people talk about. But when these people talk about the real problems, they're just excuses to indulge in their fascistic narrative. And they don't even conceptualize the problems correctly, because they do it in a cherry-picked way just to support their lowest common denominator solutions. It's pathetic. It's the blind leading the blind, to some degree, into more blindness and into more fake solutions. Anyway, I can just, sadly, I mean, this is the problem, is that in some sense it's better just to ignore the problem completely, and to properly criticize them and properly rebuke them when you can. And then when they have the curiosity to actually listen to the other side of the story, you know, see what's going on the other side of the fence, then perhaps they'll wake up from their fascistic slumber, from their disgusting worldview or something like that. And, you know, in some sense, it's, you know, this is like a phase of development in some sense. Because, I mean, I knew people that were like this when they were 8 years old, 10 years old. I could talk them out of it in the sandpit. I could talk them out of it on the playground. I could actually fix these people. But now, you know, these are people that are in their 20s and in their 30s, and they still have this bullshit. I mean, these are people that are essentially, I would call them Keegan stage 2.5, and they think that they're kind of Keegan stage higher than that, because they've kind of codependently aligned themselves with a kind of borderline narrative. They've got this hybridized cerebral histrionic disorder. That's what I would generally describe it as. I mean, and this is what made Nazi Germany the kind of depraved and hollow society that it was, with no spiritual intellectualism, no intuition whatsoever. In fact, intuition is not allowed. If you are an intuitive thinker, you have to be burnt with the books in some sense. You have to be censored by big tech. You know, the propaganda arm of the state. I mean, you know, in some sense, people always thought that we would have to only worry about government becoming the fascists, and in some sense they might be, you know, with Camilla, or what's her name? Kamala, Joe Biden and Biden Harris, Kamala Harris. Anyway, I'm very afraid if Joe Biden falls out of the picture, and what will Kamala do? Um, because already essentially this big corporation stuff, they are pushing this fascistic narrative, and now all you need to do is get a government apparatus that is just like, oh yeah, people are demanding this, so we should go along with this disgusting form of legal positivism, and actually ide- ideologically align the state with these big powers that then make it impossible to have a free society. Like, I mean, they are destroying classical liberalism. They are literally, they're trying to extinguish it. That's quite obvious. And it is fucking dangerous. It is scary. And anyway, and it's possible because the American legal system is prone to this kind of shit, which in some sense you could say it's a feature, not a flaw, because in some sense, if it is prone to this, then it means that there will be a political uproar. There will be a political manifestation to this, so that I mean, this was the promise of the American Revolution. You have a free society if you can keep it. So I mean, I'm not, like, in some sense there is a lot of latent intuition built into the American system that it's meant to be an altar. It's not meant to be a it's not meant to be a throne. For it's not the throne of righteousness, it's the altar of righteousness, something like that. But anyway, the altar is where you burn things in order to sacrifice, to make the right sacrifice, so that the engine of the solution can, because you have to give something up to make room for the truth to become manifest. That is this, let's say, a societal, sociological, collective way in which the hard structure, the legal structure in the system, with the political structure in the American system, is doing something like crucifying issues on a collective level. But in some sense, I don't really care about the collective level. It is important. It is very, very important as well. But I care more about it on the individual scale. And in some sense, everyone in America as a citizen, as an individual citizen, is a fucking lab rat as part of this collective structure. Because in some sense, this means that there is this kind of lowest common denominator. Because if you have too much power in America, if you're a rich man, people can't extract justice from you. They can't extract justice from you because you can procedurally outmaneuver them endlessly. And in some sense, the only way to actually stop the endless outmaneuvering is something like the ballot box, which has now been fucked with. It's been fucked with by big tech. It's been fucked with by probably the Dominion voting system. It's been fucked with by, if you just look at statistically, if you look at the numbers, if you look at the kind of jump, the vertical elevator jump in votes, just enough, it's just enough to get Biden over the line. It's a bit too strange, I would say, especially with all the irregularities around stopping the people from monitoring the vote count. That is insane. That is just that is just beyond freaky. Uh, that's like JFK assassination, Manchurian Project type corruption, if I might say so, in a conspiratorial tone. But that is what is being alleged. That is exactly what is being alleged, that this is a conspiracy, that this was, on a high level, a manufactured result. And the liberals in America go along with it because it suits their narrative. Never mind Somehow they forget about manufacturing consent. They forget that Noam Chomsky wrote a book called Manufacturing Consent. Somehow, well, it's just too important. The climate crisis is too important. The moral panic around identity politics is too important. This revolutionary moment is such a good catalytic opportunity for our Hamiltonian aristocracy in the waiting. We don't want to build our own independent societies. We want it gifted to us. We want it demanded. It must be signed, sealed, and delivered to us from the ether because we deserve it. And we've only got 10 years or something like that. We've got a clock to run on. So we can just say, well, if you've got money, then you should be creating a game B for us. This is the French Cajun peasantry, the peasants are revolting ambiguity. Really, you know, I mean, I can be sympathetic that, well, maybe what the rich people should be doing is that they should be funding intellects who think that, who they hope would be able to answer some of these big questions. And in some sense, I think I believe I've intellectually got the outline of the correct way of doing things. But then I guess some people will say, well, I disagree with your factoids because I believe that the climate is going to be destroyed by carbon. And I don't believe that the carbon cycle is going to cause positive feedback in an escalating climate crisis. I do think that the climate is going to radically change in the future because we're leaving the little ice age and climate has always changed. And I'll take Egyptian agriculture as the perfect example. Egypt used to be the breadbasket of Rome. Of the whole fucking Roman Empire was fed with Egyptian agriculture. Not anymore. Egypt probably can't even feed itself. The Nile no longer produces what it used to produce in the ancient world. Why is that? Because of climate change. That had nothing to do with the carbon cycle. That had nothing to do with man-made carbon destroying Egyptian agriculture. The climate changes. And we could probably do better farming, though. We could probably do regenerative agriculture, which actually means that we should eat more meat, not less meat. But the vegetarians don't like that. For moral reasons. So it's weird. Why can't we have nice things? For moral reasons. Because we're destroying the planet. We're bad people. Because identity politics tells us that our society is immoral. Because vegetarians tell us that eating meat is immoral. It's like it's this misanthropic leaning into misanthropic ideology because women are dissatisfied. Because yes, a woman will make herself dissatisfied if she doesn't have a culture that she respects. And in some sense, if you say that, well, you're allowed to disrespect the culture at your leisure, at your conjecture, and women say, well, that sounds like a nice way to take over cultural hegemony. Because if I just say that I'm dissatisfied and I am dissatisfied for good reason, but I can't explain it to you, I can't make you understand, but you just have to believe me, then I found a way to hack the system. I found a way to make everyone dance to my tune. Yeah, women will do that because that is their default asymmetrical sexual strategy. That's how women's sexuality has always fucking worked. And yes, I think it should change. And it was changing in the 90s. But then we cottoned on to these disgusting heuristics, which are like, they are cartoons of morality. They make absolutely no sense. But we just think, yeah, that's a good shorthand. Yeah, if someone doesn't want to participate, it's because the system is oppressed, not because they're a piece of shit. Not because there's something morally defective with them. Not because they didn't bother to learn and be curious and to open their eyes and to participate better. Somehow, if someone doesn't want to participate, it's on them. When I say them, I mean it's on the collective. It's on all of us. Instead of that, it's on you. So when you don't want to participate, it's never on you. It's on them. Whoever them is. And them then gets blamed on some symbolic representation of systemic oppression. I mean, this is a never-ending cycle of bullshit. Anyway, I've ranted on for quite long enough. But you see, this is more obvious in the black toxic subculture of America. It's less obvious in the Germanic way, because in the Germanic way, it's more concentrated. Because in the Germanic way, the systemic inculcation of corruption, in some sense, is that people don't know that they are the beneficiaries of sympathy, and because people don't know that because the plebs are the beneficiaries of sympathy, and they are being delivered that sympathy by the elites who are actually working in some way to help the plebs, but also probably engrossing themselves at the same time, or enriching themselves at the same time. I mean, if you really want, what's always been ironic is that Jewish bankers have always, sorry, this is a horrible historical contrast to make, perhaps, but Germany has had these disgusting conspiracy theories against the Jews for a long time. It has come out of German culture. I don't want to blame all of Germany for this, because it doesn't belong to all of Germany. It belongs to their leaders, their native, not their leaders, their, not the people who often become leaders in German society, but the natural leaders who are intoxicated by the faulty cultural mix, or whatever you want to call it, by the twerps, by the little twerps that are malcontented because they are repressed by their own culture, because they would be natural leaders in some way, but there's no space for them in German society, in German culture, in German politics. So they have no outlet, and so they come up with conspiracy theories instead, right? That's the problem in German society in a little bit of a nutshell. But what I'm trying to get at is that because it's hard for them to say we are the recipients of unearned sympathy because our elite are too good for us. Our elite are taking care of us like we're little babies. We're all little lambs. We're all little babies. The only begotten Son in Christianity, the Lamb of God, the reason why he's called a lamb is because you can sacrifice a lamb and it won't, try to sacrifice a pig, and it'll squeal, it'll kick, it'll do. A lamb, you can lead a lamb to the slaughter. A lamb will self-crucify. That's the motif of the lamb. But when you try, but that's the point of a lamb, is that in the religious symbology, at least in Christianity, is that the lamb self-crucifies. But in some sense, the German elite treat their citizens as little lambs, and they protect them, and they give them nice pastures to roam in and stuff like that. They shepherd their lambs, but they don't shepherd their lambs towards becoming shepherds themselves. They're not shepherds of their own lives. They stay lambs. So I would say that kind of shepherd actually has this weird sort of thing where, are they lambs or are they wolves? They're wolves, and then you're breeding wolves in with your lambs. Okay, this is a bit of a stupid metaphor, but anyway, I'm trying to tease and disentangle this. But to put a more blunt face on this is that it's not their fault that they grow wolves in their society, because these natural leaders are set upon by their own culture. They are rejected by their own culture because there's no place for them. And so, of course, they get their back up to the wall and they feel ground down. And then they have anger and they have rage. And then they actually almost proselytize to the outgroup. They say, yo, you're a domkopf, you don't know what you're doing, like you should have anticipated that this is what I wanted to do. Obviously, I jested. I it was the natural flow of things, learn the natural flow of things, get in line, get in line, get in line. And so then when they see someone who doesn't conform, they say, well, you must be the reason why things aren't going well, because everything else would be efficient. And the reason why it's not efficient is because we've got these unconformists. So, they end up being very, very tight and angry against nonconformity in some sense. But what's ironic is that who created the financial crisis in the world? The German banking sector, because they invented fiat currency. Who are the richest people in Germany at the moment, the German banking sector, this is the shadowy elite of things, is very, very interesting, is that somehow you get these conspiracy theories that always underline where the problem supposedly is, and the people who are eventually behind the scenes, who are, let's say, leading towards the construction of these narratives, somehow they get completely overlooked, and they end up in a weird way being the exact metaphor of the thing that is being. I mean, what was the Nazi propaganda line? The Jewish banking conspiracy cartel, or something like that. I mean, I say that the Nazis destroyed their own culture. The Nazis destroyed their own classical liberal spirit. I mean, it still survived to some degree. I mean, you should listen to the people who spoke out against Nazi propaganda. The brilliant. I mean, a lot of them were Christian. They were intellectual powerhouses. Um, and in some sense, when the Nazi society happened as well, they never conformed to it, but they didn't actively resist it. Let's just say I mean, perhaps they did to some degree, in terms of maybe hiding people or whatever. But they silently disagreed, and they bided their time, and because to speak out was actually stupid, because then you would just be sent off like everyone else. Um, I'm talking about when it really hit. Obviously, a lot of these people were very active critics, were very, very active in arguing against. I mean, it's the same climate that we have today in South Africa. Some people, like myself, are very vocal against this identity politics fascism. But, where, I mean, I do think that we are sort of reliving through Weimar Germany, essentially. That stage in history is essentially on replay right now. I mean, perhaps we're in 1920, 1918, maybe. I don't know where I put us on the scale. Um, I mean, in 10 years' time, either we'll have an immunized culture that will never fall prey to fascism again, perhaps, or we'll be living in a black fascist country in South Africa, and people in America, I will, you know, Harris, who knows how Harris would react to that? Because I mean, if Harris is the American president, and I think that she might be, she might even encourage it. She might even stoke it. I mean, that's her political rhetoric. She encourages the dissatisfaction. That's what they were called in Weimar Germany, the dissatisfaction marches, the Nuremberg dissatisfaction marches. All the proto-fascists and the Nazis marching hand in hand to undermine the liberal structure of the state, and the structure of liberal politics. And who are the people that are actually fighting against that? They are the Trump supporters. Trump supporters are, by and large, they are honest. They know where they are in their worldview. They know where they are in their moral scheme. If you disagree with them, then they'll have an honest disagreement about what they don't agree with, and maybe you can convince them, because they actually know where they are. They don't have a hypothetical moral point of view. They have a particular subjective point of view, and you can actually convince people to change their mind if they have an actual subjective point of view. But yeah, they don't want to listen to liberals talking about their hypothetical moral. Anyway, anyway is in some sense that only exists today because we have dehumanized masculine sexuality, and we've said actually masculine sexuality shouldn't exist. Men should be depersonalized so that we can instead have a fatherland, so that we can instead create a Führer principle. And that is what is currently what the zeitgeist is sat with, is that we have this looming Führer principle which the liberals in America have created, just as they created it before. I mean, Hitler was the most popular leader in Europe before the war. And that, to a large extent, also came from America, came from the Democratic side of America, where all the KKK racism has always resided in American politics. And it is not different today. And the Republicans are still the only ones who actually rally against it, because they actually have their feet on the ground to some degree. And obviously, I don't mean the GOP necessarily, because the GOP is perhaps just as corrupt as the Democratic Party in terms of the establishment, but in terms of the ideology, they are, I think, on the winning side, or they are on the more righteous side of these matters. Anyway, I guess I've spoken enough about this now. I think I've at least talked through all the complicated things. I was going to talk about my own particular understanding of how to hack the sexual marketplace. So I'm not going to go into that, but let me just say that all the remarks that I made were just a kind of motif, because in some sense I know that it's a gross generalization. It's not like the only women that are worth dating were ugly ducklings in high school that grew up into real human beings. Like, you don't have to necessarily have been ugly in high school to have developed a real character. I'm not like, that is a gross oversimplification, obviously, but I'm just trying to give you the notion because in some sense character is only built with some kind with perhaps, well, not necessarily with adversity. I mean, in some sense, some very pretty people who have a good head on their shoulders, they realize that they are skating through life. They realize that their life has been too easy, and that is also a form of adversity. It really is. If they sit with that problem and they leave no stone unturned, they can also have a wonderful character. So it's not like there's only one way. It's not like there's only one way to reach enlightenment, as it were. It's like self-realization. Uh, Sorry, when I say that there's not one way, I mean there's not one path. But in some sense, there is one way, because I've said that way is that you leave no stone unturned, essentially, um, or at least you have the attitude of leaving no stone unturned, so that it's a pursuit. First, seek the kingdom. Does it ever say that you stop seeking? No. First seek the kingdom, and then what comes second? What comes third? Well, no, that never ends. That first commandment, or that first pursuit, never ends. You are always in pursuit of the kingdom. You are always seeking the kingdom. That is the quickening spirit. That is the discerning spirit. It's an infinitive. It's an eternal life. It's an eternal understanding. The understanding, you could say, is delimited and finite, but it's an understanding that offers to you an eternal life, in its auspices, in its pursuit. And in some sense, what you're accumulating on that pursuit is perhaps a via negativa, to some degree. But in some sense, you understand that form of via negativa then is the only real game in town. But you can't make that claim. You can't actually make that. You see, you can't make the positive claim in a justified sense. You can only say that in a subjective sense, like, I believe that is the case, and I might be wrong, is the caveat on any kind of positiva. But the point that I'm making here, and this will maybe be a good way to round this off and to finish this diatribe, is when you want to, you can still you can communicate via positiva attributes. You just know that, because essentially all the properties are via negativa and all the attributes are via positiva. And so you can still communicate about attributes, but essentially it's a bit of poetry to some degree as well. And you can also duplicate that through a shared faith, essentially, and through aligning yourself in the specific context into, let's say, a shared hope as well. and a good hope. But let me just say something about the via positiva, because now it's slipping my mind. But yeah, so things like the via positiva, let me just put it in my Christian opinionated scriptural language, is that the Son of God. I'm when I say this, I'm actually directing this towards someone who I was discussing this with, because he was saying some things, because I was trying to explain to him my religious views and my metaphysics and psychology and philosophy, and I didn't like some of the phrasing that he made, because I don't like, but I mean, he wasn't saying anything wrong, because he's trying to learn about what I'm saying, but I just, so in some sense the context of what I'm about to say is more to kind of specifically address what he was saying, just to try to better his understanding, at least of my views. That it's not like, oh, and what I'm complaining about is just his use of this phrase, because to me it's not the important enough phrase, that essentially how you approach the Son, how you approach I presume he meant the Son of God or something like that, how you approach the Son. You don't approach the Son of God. You are the Son of God, and you are the only begotten Son of God, but you have to self-realize that. So in some sense, it's how you approach self-realization more so than how you approach the Son. And you can talk about approaching the Son of God, but then I would just recommend that you contextualize that more precisely, that I would rather you say approaching the only begotten Son, because that is the point of the Son of God, is that there is only one begotten Son of God, and you share that because it's an understanding. So the only begotten Son of God is a condition of your mind, which is also a condition of your heart when properly understood and homogenized. So it is a condition of the mind that is the only begotten Son of God. It's not the only begotten Son is not a person. God is not a lover of persons. God is a spirit, and you must worship God in spirit and in truth. So you must have his same spirit, and the Spirit of God incarnated is the only begotten Son, which is the condition of your mind. So in some sense, you could also say it's the form that the faith takes. So in some sense, you live in the Son in the way that you live in a culture. It's a spiritual culture, and what gives you access to that spiritual culture is that you have the discerning spirit, that you can see it. You have a spiritual way of reading and seeing, and seeing is believing, as they say. That the sight of something, you can see the value of something. You share the value in something. You share the reasoning. But is it true to say that you share the reasoning if you don't share the mind? You have to share the same mind. You have the same mind. That is not that you have the same content in your mind. You have the same form and style of thinking. So there's the same in quality, not in quantity. And this is a very dynamic thing, because you can only fully understand that, I think, if you understand psychology fully, if you understand the differences and similarities in different consciousnesses within this, because it's kind of like the elephant sort of thing. But this is why I'm so keen to tell some people that some people are beyond the pale and that they are toxic, because don't tell me about your part of the elephant if you're not interested in integrating your, like, don't tell me about your part of the elephant if you don't think that you can uh, uh, create a 3D model of the elephant. That's a bit spicy, but that's a bit of a weak metaphor maybe, but in some sense, and that's exactly the problem, is that, like, don't tell me about your part of the elephant unless you tell me what your purpose of their, we have to kind of be in the same teleological atmosphere, um, and that I would link to hope. That if we don't share a hope, and if you can't share a hope with me, then don't tell me about your part of the elephant. If you don't want to conjoin your hope with my hope, then one of us either has a bad hope and one of us has a good hope, or maybe that we just have a disparate hope, and we don't know how to mend the rift, because we would need maybe a third synthesis, because maybe between us we don't have the gifts capable of building a bridge. Anyway, okay, now let me stop this rant. And in some sense, then you have to look far afield, because if your bridge is not successful, in some sense, be judged by the fruit of your works, I guess. But the fruit is also a spiritual metaphor, and martyrs have fruit. Sometimes that fruit is not even accessible until generations after. Sometimes, context is always changing. People that were never thought of as martyrs become martyrs. In due unfolding. And in some sense, I do think that, in some sense, everyone who did not contribute in, let's say, in an overtly positive way, I do think that they will all be regarded as martyrs in some sense. That everything was necessary, that Hitler even was part of the synthesis, as it were. I do think that, we were all the sons of Adam at some point. We were all the descendants of Adam. And that's a spiritual claim. There's a claim about consciousness, more so. Anyway, let me just finally end this